So, as I mentioned, my name is Kirsten. I'm a staff person here at the Jung Institute, and we're very glad to have all of you here for our presentation, Preparing for Death as the Capstone of the Individuation Process. I have just a few housekeeping things that I need to take care of before we pass the mic over to our presenter for the day. We're hoping that each of you has one of the white handouts, which has information about the presentation, and also one of the white evaluation forms. So it's our pleasure this morning to welcome Dr. Seth Rubin to speak about this important topic about individuation from a Jungian point of view and how preparing for death is a significant part of that. And Dr. Rubin is a member of our institute and has also been certified both in Zurich and here in San Francisco. He's currently working on a book, and he was part of an investigative project called the San Francisco Jung Institute Psychotherapy Research Project. So he's contributed a lot to our field, and we're very pleased to have him here to speak with us today. And so I'd like to pass the microphone over.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I see a few familiar faces, but a lot of unfamiliar faces. Welcome. I wanted to start out by remembering Hal Bott. Hal, as some of you know, was the clinic director here for 33 years. About 10 years ago, I think it was December 2003, Hal retired very abruptly from the clinic, and a few months later he died of kidney cancer. It was a big loss for all of us. The interns at the clinic thought of Hal as a giant oak tree who provided protection and shelter for them as they were learning how to do clinical psychology therapy from a Jungian perspective. Hal was also a really good friend for me personally and professionally. He supported the research mission, which Kirsten alluded to. The research mission started here actually before I came to the Institute. Lou Stewart, and a name that might ring a bell with some of you, was a clinical psychologist who started the research work here at the Institute. And Lou also started the clinic. And he handed the clinic over to Hal, and he continued with the research. Hal built up the clinic. After I came to the Institute in 1992, Hal was a real friend and support, and he helped me to build up the research project to what it became before it ended rather abruptly in the summer of 2004. There were a lot of endings around the time of Hal's death, and so in a way it's appropriate that I mention Hal at the outset and remember him as such. We had been collaborating with Bob Wallerstein and his group from the San Francisco Psychoanalytic Institute. And we had been adding, as some of you may know about Bob Wallerstein's research, he had come up with 17 capacities to assess the effectiveness of psychoanalysis. And we added 4 more from a Jungian perspective. I'm going to talk about one of them later today. It's called the capacity to not know. My friends who hear about this say, "Oh, are you a Buddhist?" And in a way, it's a very Buddhist sort of idea. It's also a very Jungian idea. And actually, there are some psychoanalysts in the object relations field who talk about not knowing, especially when they begin an analytic session. We won't get into all of that here today. So the format, I'm going to ask for your permission at key points in the presentation. If you have questions at other times, please hold them for my prompts so that we have enough time to get through all of the material. My functions today include managing the time and the course of our process together. Now we'll go until about 10 to 11, take a 10-minute break, and then resume at 11 o'clock. We'll try to resume as close to that as possible. So I want to talk first a little bit about fear of death and death anxiety. Now, these are just working definitions I'm giving you. I don't claim that they're the be-all and end-all. As a matter of fact, for those of you who get the New Yorker magazine, there's a great article. It's called The Prisoner of Stress, What Does Anxiety Mean? By Louis Menand. I've got a copy of it here. It's based on a book written by Scott Stossel, who tried almost every treatment available for his anxiety, from drugs to yoga. Nothing worked. And so he wrote a book about it. And he calls, the title of the book is My Age of Anxiety. And it's worth reading because you'll see a pretty good, from a layman's perspective, pretty good overview of the whole issue of anxiety and its connection to depression and other things. So I would strongly recommend that you take a look at it. So for our purposes today, we'll talk about death anxiety as the morbid, abnormal, or persistent fear of one's own death or the process of his or her dying. And we'll say that fear of death is usually a shorter term and more present-focused subset of death anxiety. Now, one of my favorite illustrations, as you see in the handout, is from Woody Allen. He's a treasure trove when it comes to anxiety of all sorts, but especially death anxiety. So for a dramatic presentation of death anxiety, remember Woody Allen's film Annie Hall. Alvy Singer, and the adult version of Alvy is played by Woody, remembers a childhood experience during which he is in a doctor's office explaining to the doctor that he sees no point in doing his homework. Why? Because he had recently learned that the universe was constantly expanding and would eventually explode. The doctor tried to tell him that he needed to live each moment fully in the meantime, but it did not matter to Alvy. Neither did his mother's admonition against paying attention to things that were not, quote, his business, close quotes. Let's look at a few other quotes, and then I'll ask for some response from you. So Woody also says, it's not that I'm afraid to die, I just don't want to be there when it happens. Or, I don't want to become immortal through my work, I want to become immortal through not dying. On the plus side, death is one of the few things that can be done as easily lying down. And more seriously, the fear of death follows from the fear of life. A man who lives fully is prepared to die at any time. That's Mark Twain. And then Steve Jobs. This is an interesting one. No one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there. And yet death is the destination we all share. No one has ever escaped it, and that is as it should be, because death is very likely the single best invention of life. It is life's change agent. It clears out the old to make way for the new. Now, in science, when I was in graduate school, I was taught that often for new paradigm shifts to occur, the old guard had to die off. You had to wait till the old die in order for the new, for room to be made for the new. I've known about that for a long time. Einstein says, the fear of death is the most unjustified of all fears, for there's no risk of accident for someone who's dead. Einstein also said something interesting about fairy tales. Fairy tales are very close to my heart. Even before I became a Jungian analyst, I was quite intrigued with fairy tales. I remember as a kid having I think it was a 78 RPM record. Remember those? And on one side was Rumpelstiltskin, and on the other side was Tom Thumb. Really, I mean, I would play that record over and over and over and over again. And of course, when I was in Zurich, one of my favorite fairy tales, and I wrote a seminar paper on it, was Rumpelstiltskin. And that fairy tale holds a lot of meaning for me. Anyway, Albert Einstein also said that if you want your children to be smart, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be smarter, read them more fairy tales. All right, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Does anyone not know who she is? Everyone know who? You don't know. Okay. She was quite a leading figure, psychiatrist, in the study of death and dying. She came up with the 5 stages of grief. She did a lot of work. She opened up the field during the 60s and the 70s. So she's one of the pioneers in the study of death and dying. For those who seek to understand it, death is a highly creative force. The highest spiritual values of life can originate from the thought and study of death. And she also said, it is difficult to accept death in this society because it is unfamiliar. In spite of the fact that it happens all the time, we never see it. Now, I would imagine that most people in this room have experienced death of loved ones, one form. Maybe some haven't, but most of us have. And we're going to be talking about that too, what it's like to lose a loved one, how important it is to mourn the loss, to go through the grieving process completely before we face our own deaths. It makes our own work of dying much easier. And I will allude to some experiences I had when I finished my clinical training at Penn, and I became the staff psychologist in GYN oncology. And for a couple of years before I went to Zurich for my analytic training, I worked with a lot of women who were dying of cancer and their families and the medical staff, and learned a lot in the process. This was from about 1980 through 82. It was about the time that real interest in the field was developing, and yet there weren't a lot of people doing the clinical work. There were a few, but not too many people doing this sort of work. So let's talk about anxiety in general, just a little bit, just so we get a sense of it. Of course, Freud wrote a lot about anxiety. And for Freud, you could say that his approach was organized around anxiety. I think that's fair. Certain types of anxiety, but anxiety nonetheless. We won't talk much about castration anxiety, or other than I just have one story here. Again, from my training at Penn, we had one case conference in which the interns and the psychiatry residents followed a psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapy case for 2 years. And a well-trained, well-experienced Freudian analyst would work with this Penn student every Friday at noon for an hour, and we would watch behind a mirror. And the analyst's wife was also in the room with us. She also was a psychiatrist and Freudian analyst. And at the end of the hour, the analyst would come into the room with us, and we'd all discuss what had happened during the previous hours. A very rich experience. And on one occasion, he came into the room, and his wife said, well, this is obviously an example of castration anxiety. And we were all shook. This was 1978, 79. And the husband said, you really believe that stuff? It was quite interesting to watch the two of them argue, both Freudian analysts argue over the issue of castration anxiety. And for the wife, it was obvious they had never discussed this previously. This was the organizing principle of her approach to the work, especially with women. Okay, Freud talked about defenses against anxiety. These were ego defenses. Anna Freud developed them more fully, and they're most fully developed by George Vaillant. I don't know if that name rings a bell to you. To some of you, it does. I'll explain who he is. As I say here, he's a Harvard psychiatrist who conducted a 75-year longitudinal study, and you could find it reported in Triumphs of Experienced Men of the Harvard Grant Study. Although the primary participants in the study were Harvard men, there are studies involving women in the book, covered in the book as well. And it's really a very rich thing to read. What you find, and this is Vaillant's schema, is that there are 4 levels of defenses against anxiety, what he calls level 1, or pathological defenses, which we won't talk about much in this course. Level 2, immature defenses, fantasy, projection, passive aggression, acting out. These we see from time to time, especially with people who are facing death or who have experienced the death of somebody close to them. We can see this from time to time. Level 3, neurotic defenses, intellectualization, reaction formation, dissociation, displacement, repression, and denial. Let me give you an example from my own background of one of these defenses. I was 7 years old, and my beloved grandmother, Ida, died quite suddenly. And my parents couldn't really handle the situation very well. They weren't prepared for her death. They didn't have a plot for her. It was rather remarkable how unprepared they were. And they didn't deal with me or my brothers very well around her death. And so I was lying in bed one night, and I was just after she died, and I was thinking to myself, oh, where is she? I really miss Grandma. And then I thought, well, where was I before I was born? And then my next thought was, where will I be after I die? And that thought scared me so much that it disappeared from my conscious awareness for over 20 years until I was in my own analysis. Now, I would call that an example of repression. This happened unconsciously. It just, the idea just completely disappeared. And it came back to me when I was lying on my analyst couch. My first analysis was the Freudian analysis. And it just came back. And at that point, I had more ego strength. I was older. I was better able to come to terms with it, which I did. It took a long time to process it completely, because what I realized later on was just how important Grandma Ida had been to me. I mean, she was a very important figure in my life. So the neurotic defenses can play a part around loss of one form or another. And then there are the mature defenses: humor, sublimation, suppression, altruism, and anticipation. Now, and there are others. Some others have been added: gratitude, courage, other things have been added to this list, but these are the traditional mature defenses. Now, the interesting thing about Vaillant's research, one of the interesting things, he's been studying adult development for a long time. He's of the opinion, and there was a fellow named Daniel Levinson, that name may ring a bell with you. He was a Yale psychologist who did the research that form the basis of Gail Sheehy's work. Anyway, Valiant found that in men over time, and women, there could be a maturation of the defenses. So as the person matured, you would see a movement from the immature defenses to the neurotic defenses to the mature defenses, at least in some of the people. In the ones who are most successful in life, you would see the greatest degree of maturation. Now, I added Erik Erikson here for a couple of reasons. One is, I don't know how many of you know this, about his name. Are you familiar that he changed his name? No? Oh, well, this is good to tell. Erik Erikson was analyzed by Anna Freud, as was George Valiant. And Erik Erikson was a very interesting character. You know, he ended up in, well, he was here in the Bay Area for a long time. He was at Berkeley during the end of the 40s, and he refused to sign the loyalty oath at the time, saying that he was not a communist, he had never been a communist, and so on, and he was let go from Berkeley. Berkeley did not defend him. He ended up at Harvard. That's not too bad. Anyway, Erik Erikson had a problem with his father, and he felt that his father had abandoned the family. And so later in life, as a part of his analysis, he changed his name to Erikson. His first name was always Erik. His last name, he chose Erikson. Erik, son of Erik. He became his own father, as it were. Erikson is also interesting because he's come up, he was one of the first to talk about adult development in terms of his psychosocial stages of development. And he was a big believer, and in this sense, he was very close to Jung and Jungian thought. He was a big believer in basic trust and wholeness, that there had to be in a person's life, as a way of nurturing the person, providing the nutrients, the ground required for the person to grow, there had to be the basic trust that usually forms between mother and child, but it doesn't have to be the actual biological mother. It can be another mothering figure in the environment. And then beyond that, there has to be something else that allows the person to go through these different stages that Erik Erikson talks about. It's very close to Jung's idea of individuation. Now, how many of you are not familiar with Jung's idea of individuation? Are most of you? Everybody's familiar with it. Okay, so I don't have to go into that. But I will go into what Jung says about death. And here is his position, and I'll read it, and we'll talk about it some. Like a projectile flying to its goal, life ends in death. Even if its ascent and its zenith, are only steps and means to this goal. This paradoxical formula is no more than a logical deduction from the fact that life strives toward a goal and is determined by an aim. This is very different from the psychoanalytic idea. I do not believe that I'm guilty here of playing with syllogisms. We grant aim and purpose to the ascent of life. Why not to the descent? The birth of a human being is pregnant with meaning. Why not death? For 20 years and more, the growing man and woman is being prepared for the complete unfolding of his or her individual nature. Why should not the older man or woman prepare himself or herself 20 years or more for his or her death? Of course, with the zenith, one has obviously reached something. One is it and has it. But what is attained with death? And that's a good question, and we'll try to explore that a little bit. You know, are there any reactions to this statement, to Jung's position? No? Okay. Then we may come back to it later. For a lot of people, that's quite a startling position. You know, Freud basically believed, and I'm simplifying and overstating this, his position, that development ended with the resolution of the Oedipal conflict very early in life. And there were those who disagreed with him, especially Erik Erikson and George Valiant, who believed that development, and they were psychoanalysts, who believed that development continued throughout life. But this was not Freud's basic position. Jung was always of the position that what happened in childhood was important, but certainly the Oedipal conflict was not the be-all and end-all. As a matter of fact, Jung felt that the relationship between the child and the mother was at least as important as the relationship between the child and the father. And the Oedipal conflict has mostly to do with the relationship between the child and the father, and resolving it, mostly. Okay, so let's go on to Jung's psychological functions: sensation, feeling, thinking, intuition, their relationship to individuation and wholeness. One way of thinking about individuation is that as you become whole, you develop these other functions more completely. That is, according to Jung, we have a dominant function, an auxiliary function, and an inferior function. So, for example, and these things are paired. So, for example, most Jungian analysts are intuitive or thinking types. Not all, but most. And almost all are introverted. I haven't even brought that dimension in. Are introverted, let's say, thinking or intuitive types. If one were an intuitive type, according to Jung, if that were the dominant function, then the inferior function would be what? Sensation. And sure enough, most of us Jungian analysts are weak in the sensation area. Now, I got to tell you one story about this, though. When I was training in Zurich, one of our lecturers who'd done a lot of research on this topic, he was a psychiatrist and epidemiologist named Bash, and he had been analyzed by Jung. He lectured to us, and he had this very interesting way of combining psychological types and the European approach to psychopathology. It's very interesting. And he started off his lecture by saying, you know, my empirical research tells me that there are only 3 functions instead of 4. And I know I could be taken out to the stake for this one. And then he proceeded to tell us that it was very hard to make a distinction between intuition and sensation. He said his research showed that there was one function, not 2, a sort of intuition sensation function, and then there were 2 other functions, thinking and feeling. Interesting. It's especially interesting because if you've seen the research of June Singer and her associates, she also found that there was not strong evidence between distinguishing intuition from sensation. Interesting. So take that as you will. We will go ahead as if there are 4 functions, and we'll start with sensation. That is, as Jungians, we'll eat our vegetables before we get to dessert. Follow me? We'll do the hard work. We'll do the stuff we'd rather not do. And then we'll save the intuitive stuff that's more fun for later. All right, sensation, the reality-based aspects of preparing for death including, for example, wills, such as living and professional. How many of you here have a will, have written a will? Few haven't. How many of you have reviewed the will within the last year or two? Good. That's impressive, because in the United States, only about a third of the populace has a will. Okay? And even fewer have reviewed the will on a regular basis. So, for example, when my mother died, she had a wonderful will that was written by my father in 1967. It was, by the standards of the time, it was a perfect will. But she hadn't reviewed it. She died in 2002. And so about a month before she died, we got a hold of the will, and we discovered that the executors were all wrong. The executors, one was my father, who had died years before, and the other was a bank that was now defunct. And so we had to rush around like crazy and write a codicil, find a lawyer in Indiana, write a codicil to the will. So it's important not only to have the will, but to review it on a regular basis. How many of you have shared your will with the survivors, your children or others? Okay, fewer. This also is a good idea to do. It can be touchy. I mean, there are sensitivities here, no doubt. But it's a good idea for the survivors to be aware of what you're planning to do, what is in the will, how they're going to be affected by it or not affected. Of course, this could open up all sorts of cans of worms. There's no question. There are power dynamics at play with, wills and the rest. I'll give you one example that hit close to home recently. My older brother, 7.5 years older than I am, he died just about a month ago on December 16th. We didn't know that he was dying. And his son didn't know whether or not there was a will. His father had never talked to him about a will, about insurance, about anything, about how he wanted to be handled at the end of his life. None of this. And so this created, along with the shock of his father's death, which he was totally unprepared for, he didn't know what to do. And so luckily he was able to unearth a will and an insurance policy and other things, but it took some doing. And it's too bad that my brother didn't share this material with his son. I mean, to my way of thinking, it's a loving act to do that. I have 3 daughters. With my daughters, they're aware of the will. They've seen the will. They are aware when there's an update to the will. All the rest. I think that's important to do. That doesn't mean they're always happy with what I've done in the will. Okay, professional wills. For those of you who are professionals, how many of you have a professional will? Do you know what a professional will is? I mean, basically, you're saying you're writing out in a document how you want your practice handled after you die, how you want your patients dealt with, who's going to do it, how are your records going to be made available to whoever's handling your professional will. This becomes really important for your patients because, let's face it, I mean, we like to think at some level we're immortal, but we're not. And life is very contingent. And at any moment, I'm afraid to say, we could end up dead. Don't want to scare anyone, but it can happen. And it's important to have a document and a set of procedures of this sort in place in order to be a responsible professional. Okay. Health proxies and directives, advanced directives. How many people have health proxies? That's good. So these are things, and we're hearing about it now. There's a case of a pregnant woman who, yes, I don't need to go into it. I think it goes back, Anne Quinlan. This goes back some years, who didn't have a living will, and this caused all sorts of problems. That doesn't mean that living wills will always be followed in hospital settings. They aren't. They're supposed to be, but they're not always followed. So living wills state how you want to be handled at the end of life, and then if you have a proxy or somebody designated as your advocate, health advocate, that person is in a position to make decisions around your end-of-life issues. If you're incapacitated, this is also important. All right, death rituals. Anyone know which 3 species follow death rituals? Have them? There's evidence for death rituals. Elephants, that's one. That's good. What are the other 2? Excuse me? Crows. I'm not aware of crows. Okay. They never die alone. That's news to me. I'll have to. Well, of course, human beings and Neanderthals. Those are the 3 for whom we have definite evidence of death rituals. So what is a death ritual? Any ideas? Well, the sort of religious rituals we have around burials, memorial services, these are all death rituals. A way of coming to terms with the fact that a person has died. What do elephants, for those of you who know about elephants, what do they do? What is the evidence we have that they follow some sort of death ritual? Anyone want to give it a whack? Yes. They do. They go back and visit burial sites on a regular basis. That's one piece of evidence. Anything else? They handle the skeleton, and often they'll drag the skeleton to, a place where the person, excuse me, where the elephant was. I mean, I think of elephants almost as persons. They're very smart, sentient beings. They'll take the bone, the skeleton, back to where the death occurred. That often happens, and they'll all gather around it. It's really something to watch. We have evidence for that. I would imagine that there's also death rituals for whales and dolphins and other intelligent beings, but we just don't have the evidence for it. But I imagine, why would a whale not acknowledge death the way an elephant would? I don't know. Seems plausible to me. There's no evidence, though, that chimpanzees have death rituals, oddly enough, or gorillas. And they've been studied a lot. So elephants, in a way, are more highly developed. That's very interesting. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead in a way to talk about one, and it actually comes up later. We'll talk about it again. In religions, there are death rituals. So, for example, in the Jewish religion, there's a practice known as sitting Shiva. And what does that mean? It means after a person dies, let's say a parent dies, you sit for 7 days, you don't work, you're at home, and there are certain practices you follow depending on whether you're Orthodox or Reform or a non-observant Jew. There are certain practices that you follow, and friends and other family come and bring you food and support you emotionally and in other ways, and you focus, if it's going right, you focus on the person who has died. You talk about your feelings concerning that person. You talk about the loss that you're experiencing, and you're supported by these other people around you. It's quite, from a psychological standpoint, it makes eminently good sense. It's a ritual that's a good one to allow for a complete and orderly mourning process. All right, then the question becomes, how do you want to die? How do you want to die? Any thoughts? Quick, quick. Some people want to die. They want it to be over with. They don't want to be there when they die. I think that's another one of Woody Allen's quotes. Yeah, a quick death. Peaceful. Okay. Excuse me? Consciously, which could be different from a quick death. I mean, a conscious death could be different. You want to be there. You want to experience it. You want a death with closure. Okay? So what does that mean, a death with closure? Okay.
So in my imagining, I'd like to have it be finished in a way where there feels like a completion and a closure. I'm able to do whatever I feel necessary in order to be ready to make the transition.
Okay.
That would be graceful.
And that can mean different things. It depends on what your unfinished business is, in a way. It can mean things in terms of your relationships with other people. It can mean things in terms of projects you want to complete, the so-called bucket list. It can mean any number of things.
Really giving away the things that have meaning to people that I would like them to go to. So because for me there's soul in possessions, that there's meaning in having collected these things.
Sure. Giving away things that have meaning to you, to others, to use, to enjoy. Yeah. Any other ideas? Letting go. Okay. Letting go. So being almost a conscious decision to die, to let go, to no longer cling to life. Is that a fair statement? Yeah. Anything? Yes.
Listening to Brahms or Kira Tikhanova. That's a transport that's otherworldly. Still here.
Okay, sure. I mean, these things, it's listening to Brahms, something that's otherworldly that has meaning to you. I mean, no question. We'll talk a little bit later on about one of my favorite spiritual guides. His name was Ikkyu. He was a Zen monk. He lived from 1394 to 1481 in Kyoto. And he realized he was dying. Now, this is the story. This might be too good to believe, but the story that's been passed down. He realized he was going to die, and Zazen, Zen meditation, has always been important to him. I mean, this is one of the major features of his Zen life. And so he had his followers put him in the Zazen position, and he died in that way. That's the story, and that's a good story. Jung, at the end of his life, had some of his closest followers around him. Emma, his wife, was already dead. Tony and Carl were no longer an item, as it were. But von Franz was there, and she took notes of a number of things that he said at the end. That's how I happened to get this business about his last dream that he reported to von Franz. He also was reading Zen works at the time, and he was very interested in one particular set of Zen ideas, the ideas around Satori. And he felt that the Zen approach to Satori was almost the same thing, just another way of saying what he experienced in dealing with the collective unconscious. We'll talk about that some. So he found ways of approaching death that were meaningful to him. He also, the story goes, the night before he died, he opened up a bottle of wine and enjoyed it. He loved his wine. So he found things that were of meaning to him. All right, my position is my life, my death, my choice. I believe in seeking a gentle and meaningful death. And we'll talk a little bit as time goes on about what that means. One thing you may not be aware of, so I wrote here about the do not resuscitate order, the pre-hospital version of the do not resuscitate order here in California. How many people are aware of that? A few. Let's talk about it. It's important, especially as we get older. You have to decide whether or not you want to be resuscitated or allowed to experience, as it's also called, allow natural death. Allow yourself to die naturally. So a traditional DNR or no code or code blue is the legal order written in the hospital to respect the wishes of a patient not to undergo CPR or advanced cardiac support if the patient's heart stops or the patient stops breathing. In California, a patient may execute a pre-hospital DNR or AND, allow natural death, and file it with his or her physician. And this is important. It has to be filed with your physician. It is a good idea to keep a properly signed and notarized AND on the front of the refrigerator at home. And on your person. The term AND is gaining favor over DNR because the term focuses on what is being done, not on what is being avoided. The term DNR is also criticized because, first, only about 5%, and I was shocked when I learned these statistics, about 5% of patients requiring life support outside the hospital survive. And number two, only about 15% of patients who require life support while in the hospital survive. Wow. On TV you see code blue, and they rush in and do these things, and the patient is immediately revived. That's all. Most of the time that isn't what happens. AND does not affect any treatment for other interventions that would require, other than interventions that would require CPR intubation. Patients can continue to receive any other form of treatment. So how many of you have this type of form? Have any of you executed it? A few. I have. Few of you have. And how many of you have filed it with your physician? Okay, good. Some have. Yes, ma'am. Right.
Which is also a doctor's order.
Right.
How does that fit in with AND?
It's a little bit different. I mean, this is something that's definitely initiated by the patient. I tend to be in favor of things that are initiated by the patient, by the person. It's a little bit different. The patient or the person initiates this and goes through the paperwork, gets it notarized, and then files it with the doctor. The other thing is it's more physician oriented, although it affects the patient. But this is a little bit, I like the fact that the origin starts with the patient in this respect. Yes, ma'am.
The problem with that is that because unless it's signed by the physician,
right,
it may not be applicable in the hospital setting, or the hospital setting may not have access to it. Whereas the good pulse form is
true.
Is universally applicable and required by law to be followed. So I think there's value for both.
Okay, and let me tell you
because
about
a lot of things. I mean, if your private physician, your personal physician may have your wishes.
right.
Your personal physician more and more doesn't have hospital privileges, and
True.
you're in the hands of the emergency room or the hospitalist. So.
All right, let me tell you another thing. There are several things you can do. You can have a do not resuscitate card on you. along with your DNR. And then there's a place called, there are a number of places around, there's a place called U.S. Living Wills. It's a repository for your, because the same thing applies with your living will. It's a repository for, I can make the information available if people are interested. I can give you references to that. It's a place where you can register your living will, your DNR, your advanced healthcare directives, all the rest. It's in New Jersey, and you have a card, and the hospital calls. Now, you know, the hospital can refuse to do any of these things, but theoretically, the hospital calls up and checks on these, and the living will and the DNR are made, or the AND are made available. Yes, ma'am. Sure.
You could be in another state.
Right.
And they don't know. And you're not on the registry, they don't know. So,
well, that's why the U.S. Living Will Registry is a good thing, because it's a, they're set up, the registry is set up. By the way, I have no financial stake in any of these things. Let me make that clear. But the hospital can call up and check with the U.S. Living Will Registry, and they'll find record of your AND or DNR. Now, the problem is, what if you're in a state, and there's some states that don't recognize these? That, well, you're out of luck. I mean, what can I say? And there are, don't die in that state or get really sick in that state. I mean, we see that through, I mean, if you have bad luck in this area, it could be a real problem. So stay away from certain states, certain red states. Okay, so DNR, so let me tell you about, let me give you the exact reference here for the registry. I have the card here somewhere, and of course I'm having trouble finding it. Here it is, U.S. Living Will Registry, and I can give you a phone number for it. It's 800-548-9455, or the website is uslwr.com. Sure, 800-548-9455, or the website is uslwr.com. That's right, yeah. Yes.
The Senator's Psychological Association sponsored a program by a woman who has an agency called Exit Stage Right. She offers, she goes into homes after people die, many times quarters, and she
Right.
goes through every, and she found $13,000 in the kitty premiums jar once.
Right.
But she has a workbook or a CD that you can purchase that is very flexible, but it has everything that it has everything that your people who live after you would want to know.
Oh, good.
At the time of your death, and I put it into a binder
Okay.
along with all of these things, and
Okay.
showed the binder to my kids.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
That's a very good idea.
So it's called Exit Stage Right.
Exit Stage Right. Okay.
Very useful.
Yes. You know, a lot of this, how to put it, gradually over the years, our society has become more open to people taking charge of their lives and deaths at the end. It wasn't always this way. back in 1980, Derek Humphrey, that name may ring a bell to some of you, who he started, he worked a lot in this area after his wife Jean died of cancer. And it was an awful death that she went through, and he tried to help her along the way. But he's written a lot about this, the Hemlock Society, and now it's called Final Exit Network. There are, in Switzerland, there's a place called Dignitas. Does that ring a bell to anyone? It was actually featured on one of the 60 Minutes programs. It helps people to face death who are in awful conditions and to die according to their own wishes. The Swiss, since 1942, have allowed assisted suicide, which is rather unusual if you think about it. But Switzerland's an unusual country in many ways. It was a Calvinist country, Calvinist religion, but the Swiss have had a long time to get over all of that stuff. And, you know, the Swiss are very open about sex, drugs, and death. And it's just that simple. We're catching up to them slowly but surely. Yes, ma'am.
There's also the California Association of Compassionate Care.
Right.
As part of an alternative.
Right. Or compassion and choices. That's another.
That's right.
Yes. Yes. There are a number of things that are available nowadays for approaching end of life. Oregon, for example, has a program. Few states do, but California does not. And so in California, we do have the DNR, or allow natural death. And that's an important thing to know, especially, you know, I just learned this recently. When my father died in 1979, he had a massive heart attack. And what I didn't know was that my mother called in the paramedics, and they worked on him for about an hour after he died. And I learned from my younger brother, after my older brother died, that he said, it's a good thing you didn't see our father, because he was all black and blue, and there were broken bones, and he was already gone. And from my younger brother's perspective, my father's body had been abused. Now, I didn't see any of that, but I certainly wouldn't want to be handled that way. I don't know how. Other people may feel differently. Other people may feel, do whatever you have to do to keep me alive. And that's fine. I mean, it's your choice to go one way or the other. Okay, let's see. Why don't we take our break now, and then we'll continue at 15 to 11. And we'll stop now. This is a good time to stop, and we'll go on from there. So a few things have come up during the break. One is my oversight. I did not talk about prearrangements for burial and or cremation. And let's talk a little bit about that. How many of you have made prearrangements? A lot, but some, not as many as with living wills and the rest.
When you say prearrangements, do you mean expressing your wishes to your
Oh no,
or
actually, well, let's say buying the plot,
right.
or so I'll give an example. So in my case, about 10 years after my mother died, and I was working through my mourning process, I created, and I'll talk about this some more later, what I call an exit transitional object in the form of a titanium cremation urn. I had it specifically made, and through, most of you know what active imagination is? Well, I did an active imagination around this, extended over a long period of time, and I came up with symbols and other things that I had laser engraved on the lid of the titanium cremation urn. So it has real meaning for me. But at the time, I was carrying the cremation urn in the trunk of my car because I didn't know what am I going to do with this. I had some wild ideas. I had lunch with John Beebe. A lot of you know who John Beebe is. He's an older, well-established, very bright Jungian analyst in our community. And I showed him the urn. He said, oh, he loved it. And he said, I know exactly the right place for it. The columbarium. Some of you may know about the San Francisco columbarium. It's a place that has niches for urns, among other things. And so I went, took my urn over there, and I met with one of the staff people, and I knew right away it was the right place. And so I got a niche. Eventually my wife did, and or she would say, we're ganiched. And the columbarium is handled through the Neptune Society, and the Neptune Society allows you to set up what they call pre-arrangements for cremation. So you can, we did the whole 9 yards. We'd set up the everything, including a memorial service, which will be held in, it's not quite an auditorium, but it's the central meeting place in the columbarium. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, what I did and why. So yes, pre-arrangements can be for cremation. Now, for burial. So I told you about what happened when my grandmother died. Well, my father learned from the experience. I've got to give him credit. He learned from the experience, and he went out and bought 4 or 6 plots in a Jewish cemetery near O'Hare Field. We lived near Chicago. And he and my mother are buried there. No one else is. But he and my mother are buried there. And he had made all of the arrangements. Actually, you can take care of all of the arrangements except for the death certificate. You're not allowed to pay for the death certificate ahead of time. That's something your heirs have to do. You cannot do it. Right now, I think it's about $125 in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Is there a reason for that?
I don't know what the reason is. I don't know.
Like to prevent fraud?
Excuse me?
Prevent fraud?
Perhaps to prevent fraud. That could be. I don't know. But they won't allow you to do that. In California, I can't speak for other places. Then another question came up about names, Eric Erickson, and I just wanted to say something about the power of names. And as I mentioned, he held special interest for me because in my first Jungian analysis, the centerpiece of my work was my own name, which I ended up changing after a year of analysis. And I kept my last name, Rubin, which was my father's name, although given the way names were changed when people came through Ellis Island, who knows what it was, really. I kept the last name. And then in my Jungian analysis, I worked a lot on the other 2 names, Seth and Isaiah. And of course, being a good Jungian, I looked for all the amplifications and all the meanings. And I really processed this thoroughly. The last piece of the puzzle for me was realizing that the initials of my new name, Seth Isaiah, were S.I., Cy Rubin. That was my father's nickname. And he had died a year before. In the Jewish religion, that period, a year after the death of a parent, is an important time. That's often when the stone is uncovered, the tombstone, however you want to call it. And I had to decide, do I want to honor my father in this way? He and I had a difficult relationship, but I decided I did. So I, in a way, honored him 1 year after his death by taking on this name, Cy Rubin, Seth Isaiah. When I told my mother, who was in her 70s, that I was changing my name, and this part of the story, she accepted it immediately. she thought it was a great idea, and she never made a mistake with my new name. So I guess what I did was psychologically well-grounded in that respect. It really connected to her. So names do have importance, and I can also say that after I changed my name, it was a real problem. I can appreciate what women go through when they have to change their names and all the passport and diplomas and everything else. I mean, it's just, I couldn't change my name on my birth certificate. That's not allowed. But everything else was changed, and it was a real pain. So I appreciate what women go through.
That's why many of us no longer do.
No longer. I understand that. Any questions about the material we covered in the first part? Any comments? Yes.
I have a comment.
Yes, sir.
When you asked about other animals, I was thinking about an experience that I had that I wanted to share with some friends whose cat, 15, 16-year-old cat had died, and was a real part of their family. So these two guys laid the cat out to rest in its bed, where the other two animals would always come to sleep together, a dog and a cat. So by providing a ritual for themselves, and they invited friends over for this ritual to witness it, the other cat and the dog slept with the deceased sibling for 2 nights. And then after the second night, they retreated and they removed the corpse the next morning.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, so it got me some sense that other species may have some capacity if they're given some structure.
Right. That makes sense. Okay. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
Just to follow up on that, if it's an if it's an insensitive ritual, for example, there's a woman whose mother came home from school when she was 7 to find her mother lying on the dining room table with her body, and the mother had died in the morning. That trauma has passed down 2 generations to a deep fear and denial of death in the granddaughter of this woman who was laid out on the dining room table. Terrible trauma for that child at 7.
Absolutely. Yeah. Death can be very traumatizing, especially to children, especially if they're not handled well around the loss of people important to them. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I had the experience of an absolute wonderful death. A dear friend of mine who did not have children, but she was dying of cancer, and she completely planned her death and gave away all those things that were meaningful to her, to specific individuals she wanted to have them. I was blessed to get her collected works of Jung. And then she planned how she wanted, what she wanted to wear, or jewelry she wanted to have on, the candles she wanted in the room, the music she wanted playing on the record player, and then asked her, there were about 10 of her close friends who were going to be there, and asked each of us to select our most meaningful reading to read as she was passing. And it was absolutely the most beautiful thing. I mean, it was very powerful.
Absolutely.
Planning your own death can be a just absolutely incredible experience for the people who are sharing it.
Absolutely. I agree. One of my colleagues, about 4 or 5 years ago, I gave a talk on this subject at one of the monthly dinner meetings of the Institute to the analyst members. And one of the members, mothers, she knew she was going to die about a year ahead of time, and she had some form of terminal illness. And she decided she always wanted to live in a place that served her gourmet meals. So she found a place in San Francisco, and she moved in, and people would come and visit her and so on. And at the very end, she got her gourmet meals, and at the very end, she let everyone know that she was going to be dying, and the family came and visited, and it worked out. I mean, it's nice to hear those sorts of stories. They're wonderful stories when you hear things of that sort. Sure. It's a gift. Yes.
I have a question regarding our variance theme.
Okay.
In level 4, he mentions humor, sublimation, altruism, and anticipation.
Right.
But I don't agree why he puts suppression in there. Do you have any idea? I don't agree that suppression is the true defense.
Really? Well, let's talk. I don't want to go too far afield here, but as I understand the defense, is what makes a defense more mature is how much consciousness is involved in exercising the defense. So how does suppression differ from repression? Repression happens unconsciously. That's the story I told about myself when I was a kid. I had this fear and then just disappeared automatically. My consciousness wasn't involved at all in the defense. This happened automatically, outside of conscious awareness. Suppression is different. It involves consciousness, conscious awareness. What you basically say is, all right, this is one way of thinking about it. All right, I'm faced with the situation now, but instead of dealing with it now, I'm going to put it off, let's say for a day, a week, a month, something, until I'm in a better position to handle it. So it's a lot like anticipation in a way. There's consciousness involved. It's not happening unconsciously. You're making a conscious decision about when and how you're going to deal with the anxiety-provoking situation. So in that sense, it is mature.
I call it the Scarlett O'Hara defense.
This guy.
I'm going to tower, and I'll think about that tomorrow.
Well, but then you have to think about it.
Well, yes.
That's the point. I mean, right. You do have to come to terms with it. You can't just put it off indefinitely. Then it becomes something else. Okay. There was another. Yes, ma'am.
I was feeling into how important it is that we have our wills and the logistics in place for our loved ones.
Right.
And how essential it is to allow them to have that closure that I was talking about earlier with us. And so creating that kind of a gathering with your friend seems so important and respectful and honoring of the need that we all have to know how to grieve and how to support the person dying. And, so there's a relationship there that's happening all the way to the very end that I think allows there to be a feeling of that completion. It's so important. I sing in a threshold choir which sings at the bedside of people transitioning. So for me, I realized that, this is a practice. I'm practicing preparing for dying in a good way. And so every time I'm able to be at the bedside of people and families working with that, I'm sure it's same with people who work in hospice, there's that hands-on or that immediate process of practicing. What does it mean to die and how do we die? And then in our choir practices, we can lay in the chair in the center and have these angelic voices singing to us. So then we can actually, this might be how it would feel if I wanted to have people singing to me as I transition. And it's quite a beautiful thing to actually practice dying. And life seems to continually ask that of us anyway.
It does as we get older and lose function, for sure. Yes, yes.
I'd like to hear more about the unconscious and how the unconscious stories. I'm thinking of Jane Wheelwright and her book, Death of a Woman.
Okay.
And I'd like to hear more about that since we're sitting here in this Union place.
Okay. I was going to talk, and this fits now. I will talk about a couple of my patients when I was working at Penn and GYN oncology, there were a few who really stood out. There was one woman who was dying. She had just been diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. She was married. Her husband was an organic chemist. He called himself a string man. And she knew that there was some piece of unfinished business, but she didn't know what it was. And we kept looking at her dreams and seeing what the unconscious had to say about the unfinished piece of work. And eventually it came out in one of the dreams that her mother had died 10 years earlier, and the mother had been cremated, and the mother had asked her to dispose of the ashes or scatter them in California. Now, I was at the University of Pennsylvania. This was in Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia, in Philadelphia. And my patient hadn't done that. What she had done was stored the ashes in her closet. So we had to bring the ashes out of the closet, so to speak. And then she flew them out to California and scattered them here in California. We got at that work through her dreams, through dealing with her telling her story through her dreams, through making requests of the unconscious. She knew there was something missing. And then once, there was one other piece that we had to take care of too. She was concerned about what would happen to her husband after she died. And that came out in the dreams in a variety of ways. And other than that, she had been an alcoholic up until 10 years earlier when she found the Quaker religion, which the Quaker religion is a very interesting one. It's more psychologically oriented, in my opinion, than a lot of religions. There's even on the East Coast a Quaker Jungian conference on psychology and religion every year. Anyway, we worked on her evolving spirituality through the dream work, through the stories that the dreams were telling her. Once she had completed her unfinished business, then it's as if the unconscious was willing to go in other ways and go deeper. And we went much deeper after we took care of that. Now I should mention, not all stories have happy endings. So she was able to die then, and peacefully. But about a week later, her husband had a massive heart attack. And he survived it, but he was never the same. I mean, in a lot of ways, his heart was broken by the death of his wife. You see that. I see that a lot in my patients. There will be some major loss, and then there's something like a heart attack or some other major health assault on the person. It's not uncommon. If a person, I'll give you one other example. If a person has a house and then that person's invested a lot of time and energy in the house, and the house becomes the centerpiece of their existence, it's not uncommon when after they sell the house that they have a heart attack or some other major life event. Now, it's one thing if the person is more psychologically minded and can work on this ahead of time and get in touch with the unconscious and process some of these feelings, get in touch with the unconscious story, as you put it, and deal with this ahead of time. But if not, yes, ma'am.
Well, I also think maybe I heard Joseph Henderson talk about death once,
Yes.
and he said, follow the archetype.
Jung
And
said that too.
Oh, did Jung say
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
So I always wonder what that means to follow the archetype.
Well, we're going to talk about that because I have it in one of the quotes.
Good.
The second quote about Jung.
Okay.
He said, follow the archetype. Now, what does that mean?
What is that?
Well, that means different things for different people. Jung also said, as you follow the archetype, create your own myth, basically.
Well, how do you do that?
Well, okay.
You're going to have a workshop here.
Yeah, well, really. I mean, you do it through your dream work, through your active imagination, through your work with other people. A lot of this work can be done on your own, no question. But some of it involves another person because we all have our blind spots, and we can't see those blind spots. It takes another person to see the blind spot. Also, it's helpful to work with someone who's further along the path than we are. Yes, you can create your own myth, but it's not totally. I would call it somewhere between creating and discovering your myth. It's somewhere in that range. It's not created out of whole cloth. It's not if it's authentic. It's created out of an interaction, sort of dance you engage with with the unconscious. That's where the myth making happens. So it's something that unfolds over time. It's something that happened. So okay, after my mother died, I was surprised by how shook I was by her death. My death anxiety, I haven't experienced death anxiety in a long time. It returned with a vengeance after she died on September 21st, 2002. And I was coming to terms with it through my dream work, through my active imagination. It was through that work that I created this urn. This urn was not just something, it had a lot of psychological meaning for me. It was part of my myth, as it were. And I had to come to terms with this death anxiety through this work. And I called this forming an exit transitional object. Some of you may be familiar with Winnicott's work on transitional objects, you know, the blanket that a child has, a comforting object that allows the child to make the transition from, call it the archetypal realm, into consensual reality. I mean, in a way, that's what happens. As we from a Jungian perspective, as we grow up, our parents help us to humanize, if things are going well, the archetypes, and we're able to engage in consensual reality. That, as Winnicott put it, the transitional object enables the child to sort of bind the anxiety and make that transition more smoothly. For me, as an adult, after my mother died, this anxiety, this death anxiety came back. And I started working through active imagination on this urn. I didn't know what was going to come out of it. I didn't go in there planning to create this. I was doing an active imagination over days, over months, and out of it came this urn in the way that it did. I call it an exit transitional object because it was helping me to bind the anxiety I was experiencing after my mother's death and to face the transition I was going to have to make in approaching death. And it was very helpful for me to create this and then to find the niche through John Beebe's help at the columbarium. And as I mentioned in my ritual at the end of this 5-page document, I go to the columbarium on a regular basis and I meditate next to the niche and I experience, this works for me. I'm not saying everyone should have a columbarium or a niche. No, you should find what works for you. But I found that by doing this, I experience serenity, groundedness when I'm in the proximity of my niche and this urn. And it makes, I can even conjure up the image of that place and that item. And I experience their real peacefulness and groundedness. But this has taken many years to do. I've been involved with this part of my process for 10 years now. As I also mentioned in the handout, what I do as part of my ritual is I take friends and family members to the niche and we touch base with the niche and then we go out and eat together. We have a nice meal. We enjoy life. I mean, it's not just focusing on death. It's dealing with life too. I mean, I'm a big believer in that. So that works for me. Now, what would work for you? Well, the only way I can tell you, especially if you're following the archetype and your version of the archetype, your version of what you're experiencing of the archetype, is that you have to engage your dream work, active imagination, and see what you can conjure. You might come up with something as a first approximation, and then put it to the unconscious and see how the unconscious responds to it. There's sort of an interactive, this is what I've experienced, there's an interactive process between the conscious position and the unconscious, often mediated by an analyst or another person, but often not, where you can do this work yourself and find, maybe through a method of successive approximations, you can come up with something that will work for you and find your own myth, as it were. Yeah. Now, I know I get into trouble when I say this. I'm going to say it anyway. I admire Marie-Louise von Franz extremely. She's, as many of you know, she's a remarkable, especially in the area of fairy tales. Mm-hmm. She's a remarkable person. She's written a lot. Whenever I teach a fairy tale course, I always make use of her work. She is world class. What I don't like about her is that she followed in Jung's footsteps too closely, and she almost became a sort of imitation of Jung. So Jung had his tower. If you've read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, or any of the other works, you know about Jung's tower. This is what he created later in life, where he would go as his retreat, and he would be creative and away from civilization. Well, von Franz created her own tower, and it's a smaller version of Jung's. I mean, it bothers me because my understanding of the Jungian approach is that you create your own myth. You don't follow the myth of Jung. I mean, Jung's myth fit Jung, and it's a great myth, and we've learned a lot from Jung because of his myth and his myth making, no question. But the idea is you have your own dreams, you have your own active imagination, you have your own life, and you use those as the building blocks for your myth. Don't imitate Jung, please. Don't do that. That isn't what individuation is about in my book. Now, I've been told that, well, there's another way of looking at it, that, you know, you can envy, although I don't, but you can envy von Franz for being in the supportive shadow of the great man. And so, okay, and so she was protected in a way, the way the interns were protected by Halbat. You remember they had the image of Halbat as being the great oak tree, and he provided them with the protection and the security as they were beginning as interns. Well, von Franz was, I would have liked to see her create her own thing, whatever it was, and not try to follow Jung so closely. That's my view. And others will criticize me for that, and so be it. That's how I view the situation. Yes, sir.
I actually have a question for one of our online viewers.
Okay.
Here are two statements from a Buddhist book, Peaceful Death, Joyful Rebirth, a Tibetan Buddhist guidebook by Tuglu Gadam. Number one, rebirth is a major pillar of several Eastern belief systems. Many great Buddhist masters have actually been able to remember and describe their past experiences. And quote number two, according to Buddhism, everyone takes rebirth after death. Can some analysis, preferably with Buddhist knowledge, comment on the Tibetan Buddhist detailed experience on teaching and teaching on dying, death, and rebirth?
I know a little bit about the Buddhist approach. Does anyone feel comfortable addressing that question before I stumble around? Well, Buddhism isn't the only religion that talks about rebirth. Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, also posits rebirth. It's called Gilgul. I know a little bit about that. And the idea is that you are reborn, and your station is based upon your spiritual development. Your station as a reborn person is based upon your spiritual development in this life, essentially. I think it, I read something recently by the Dalai Lama, who's a very interesting person. I admire him greatly. He's open to scientific practice, methods, and findings, and he has opened up Tibetan Buddhist meditation to scientific research. He's opened up other aspects of Buddhism to science, and as I understand what he's saying now, he's not so sure about reincarnation, believe it or not. He's not so sure he wants to pick his next heir, for example, which is part of the Tibetan Buddhist practice. But I'm certainly no expert in this area. Yes?
I like to comment on this.
Yeah.
I come from a Zen Buddhist background,
Okay.
not Tibetan.
Okay.
And it's my understanding that the Buddha himself, historically and scripturally, chose not to address the issue of afterlife as not being relevant for dealing with the suffering of life.
Right.
And that the ideas of reincarnation, rebirth, and so forth were actually cultural ideas that were in place at the time and are often culturally based rather than based in the ideas and practice of the Buddha himself. But this varies very greatly from culture to culture.
I imagine.
So, and in Zen, there's more of a tendency to not to address the issue, similar to the tradition that is followed, is thought to be followed from the Buddhist
Sure.
himself.
Right. Yes, sir. Oh, could you pass the mic back, please?
No pretense to knowing anything at all about Buddhism. In the book Liberation in the Bardo, commonly known as the Seth Book of the Dead, the dead soul is supposed to encounter all these horrific deities, these horrific monsters. And if you get scared of them and run from them, they chase you down through eternity and you reincarnate as a cockroach or a rat or whatever.
Okay.
Whereas if you are chanting the name of your guru, which I interpret as being present, being here and now, they reveal themselves to be the great deities in support of you and you reincarnate in their plateau. It always seemed to me that it was talking about reincarnation every moment. Now, and we either run from our fears or embrace them.
Okay. I would also point out, for those of you who are Coen brothers fans, there was a movie called The Serious Man.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And if you remember that death played a major role, and so did bar mitzvah, both did, in the movie, among other things. And the rabbi at one point is talking about the death of Cy Abelman. Remember him? Anyway, he died, and he was a really unscrupulous sort of scoundrel, but he was lionized by the rabbi. And the rabbi went on to say, now, of course, and this was conservative Judaism, I believe, and we don't talk about an afterlife as such. And you don't get a gold star if you live a good life, and so on and so on and so on. And that was basically, I was raised as a Reform Jew, and my rabbi always said, the focus is on living your life now, and living it ethically, and living it to the fullest capacity you possibly can, and not focusing on what happens after life is over. I believe this is true, that that's a a part of normative Judaism, but not mystical Judaism. In Kabbalah, there is Gilgul. There is the whole idea of reincarnation and the transmigration of the soul. But that is not the case in normative Judaism. Any other? Yes, ma'am. Is there a microphone somewhere?
I just wanted to mention, probably some of you have heard of the Hugging Guru Amma. She comes to the Bay Area twice a year. It's considered a realized saint, totally merged with God. And she says about death, it's like losing a hair on your head. And she also says that until you are not ruled by your thoughts and your desires, you will not be able to be like her and merge with God, and you will keep coming back.
Okay. Yes.
From my studies of Buddhism, I'm not a Buddhist, but my studies of Buddhism, that I understand that the more conscious are dying, the more likelihood we have for an auspicious rebirth. And that's one seed that I have held on to that made sense.
Sure. Oh, back here.
No, I like to think of the process of individuation being one that would probably come to a pinnacle at the time of death.
Yes.
And at that time, it's like you stop the process because you no longer want to be individuated. You want to let go of the ego and the boundaries of the soul so you can merge. And I think for me that sort of brings it together in a Jungian way, and also with several other philosophical ways of coping.
Okay. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about attachment. We are, in a manner of speaking, attachment and loss. We've sort of gone around this issue. I'm thinking primarily about Bowlby's work. Bowlby was a Freudian analyst who became, I guess you could say, more of an object relations. Well, you could say that. He studied attachment and loss, especially in the widows who lived in and around London. And he found that those who went through what he called disordered or incomplete grieving processes over the loss of, let's say, a spouse or a parent, were more susceptible to depression, serious depression. And this is one reason why it's important to do this sort of work, to go through the mourning process. Now, as I understand, and I'm still waiting to see what the new DSM is going to look like. We're on DSM-4. DSM-5 is coming up. Right.
No. We're out.
5 is out?
Yeah.
I haven't seen it yet. Okay, thank you. As I understand it, there used to be a distinction between dysphoric feeling connected with grieving and depression. But I'm not sure that distinction holds anymore. Do you know?
Not in DSM-5. It doesn't meet.
Okay. But the way I was trained is that you follow the dysphoria for several months before you view it as clinical depression, and you work with it as a part of the grieving process. But I'm not sure DSM-5 holds to that anymore.
I think that DSM-5 now includes depression as a part of grief for some people, and that it is then a treatable disorder called depression.
Right.
Within the grieving process.
Right. And so it could be that, and the other thing I was taught was that when a person was going through the grieving process, you were less likely to start a course of antidepressant medication treatment. I don't know if that's still the case or what the recommendation
patients are now. I would hope so. I don't know. Okay, so I talked about the stage 4 ovarian cancer patient. She was quite something. She grew into death. She continuing developing her spiritual side. Her dreams showed it. She showed it. She was I learned a lot from accompanying her as she went into death. After she took care of her unfinished business, she continued to individuate. And she did it largely through her Quaker faith and through her work with dreams. We didn't do any active imagination. But she worked a lot with her dreams. And this provided her the way into death that was awe-inspiring. I don't know how to put it other than that. It was really something to experience with her. On the other side of it, one of the people I worked with, and this is out of many, many people I worked with, was a Penn student. She was a freshman. Her mother had taken diethylstilbestrol, utero, to prevent spontaneous abortions. And this was common practice way back when, fortunately. And she had developed a form of adenocarcinoma, and she ended up dying from it. And she came on to the Clark unit, the GYN oncology unit. She was a very difficult person to work with because she was so young. She was in the bloom of life. She was just starting out at the University of Pennsylvania. I worked with her family too, and of course, they were inconsolable. And the nursing staff on the Clark unit had a very hard time dealing with her because they were over-identifying. So she was at the beginning, and there was no way to really work through individuation quickly with her. It was just a matter of crisis intervention for her and for the family. It happened very quickly. And it was very sad to see that. And this was very hard work. The other thing I could say about working with people, I found that there were some, too many, who were so frightened of death and dying and had so few relationships in their current lives that they would grab on to me as a sort of transitional logic and try to drag me into death with them. And this was most uncomfortable. I was called in often when these patients would become a burden to the medical staff and the nursing staff. And it was hard to work with them. It was very, very hard. It was hard work. I mean, for 2 years, I was spending about 20 hours a week working with patients of all sorts on the Clark unit, and it was too much. I think you have to, when you're doing this type of work, you have to really, how to put it, manage your energy, as husband, your resources very carefully. This can be very, very difficult work. I respect hospice work tremendously. When my mother died, she had a hospice nurse who would come into her home and be with her, and the hospice nurse was fantastic. And she would keep me informed of what was going on. And, of course, my mother wasn't psychologically minded at all. And it's too bad. It's one of those odd things. But she didn't want to work with dreams. She didn't want to do anything of this sort. She just didn't want to die, period. And she thought that somehow she would beat death. But none of us can. We're all going to die eventually. Okay. Mourning our own losses of function and health as we age and decline. Well, a lot of you realize that we're at an age where things just don't function as well as they used to. We're getting older. We're not physically, mentally, psychologically, we're not as resilient as we once were. And these are real losses we're experiencing. I know for myself, I can't do the sorts of things I used to do. When I was in Zurich training, I was in my 30s. I would run 40 or 50 miles a week. I can't do that now. I mean, I wouldn't even try it, and I end up hurting myself. Physically, I could do things that I can't do now. Intellectually, I could do things then that I can't do now. My memory isn't as good, especially for names. I don't know about the rest of it. It can get embarrassing at times. I should remember the name, and I can't. And that's a real loss, and I have to mourn that. I have to say, well, I'm getting older. I can't do these sorts of things the way I used to. That's true for all of us. I have a good friend who some of you know, Bob Wallerstein, who's now 93. We have lunch regularly. He's an amazing guy. I mean, he still writes papers. He still does intellectual work. His mind is fine. From what I can tell, it's as good as it ever was, but it probably isn't. I'm biased. I'm his friend. So I tend to see function where there may be less of it. But physically, I can see over the years he's declined. He's no longer able to get around the way he used to, and he talks about the way that someday he won't be able to drive anymore. And what will that mean? Joe Henderson, somebody mentioned Joe Henderson, a remarkable founder of this institute. He lived to be 104. I would come to dinner meetings with him when he was in his 90s. He'd drive his little Volvo. It was something, and he would sit at the dinner table and have about 4 or 5 glasses of wine. And I'd think, this was at night, and I would think, oh dear, I better follow him over the bridge. He lived in Marin. So I'd follow him over the bridge, and he made it home safely up until he started not making it so safely, and he started having accidents, and he had to give up driving. And for older people, this is a major loss of autonomy. No play on words intended. It's a major, and older people can fight this tooth and nail. They don't want to give it up. Why? Because in our culture, getting your driver's license is a sign that you've come of age. It's a ritual. It's a rite of passage. And especially in this country, especially in the Bay Area, it's hard to get around without a car. It's very hard. And so one of the things I've said to Bob, and this is what Joe did, Joe eventually had a few small accidents, and then he had to give up his driving, and he hired a driver, a fellow named Joe. this fellow would take him everywhere. That worked out fine for him. One of the things we professionals have to keep in mind, how long do we keep practicing? Are we still competent to practice? Are we doing our clients, our patients, our analysons a disservice by practicing? We have to keep this in mind. Now, I've seen different sides of this with Frau Jaffe, my beloved analyst in Zurich. I worked with her when she was in her 80s, and her mental capacity was fine. And her function was fine. Physically, she was a mess. Eventually, she ended up losing her eyesight. She couldn't walk around. She handled it quite gracefully. She was quite able to come to terms with her losses. I've seen other people who I knew one person in Swarthmore, where I used to live and practice, one therapist who developed cancer, and instead of letting her patients go, recruited her patients as her support system. And so she turned the whole game around, so to speak. The patients supported her, and she made use of them while charging them a fee until she died. And this made a lot of her patients came to me, and we had to spend a lot of time processing that. And their feeling of betrayal, their betrayal of trust, and it was an awful experience. I learned from that. So we therapists, analysts, have to be careful about knowing when to draw the line. Now, many of us do. We don't have to be told. We relinquish these, and it's not easy to do if you've spent your whole life doing it, deeply invested in it. Sometimes at the Jung Institute, we have committees specifically designed for sort of assessing issues that could come up with and they have with analysts who have become incapacitated for one reason or another. And I'm not going to go into the details, but suffice it to say, this institute is especially responsible about attending to those issues. So if someone is showing signs of not being able to function effectively as a therapist or analyst, the institute will intervene one way or another. It does. And that's a good thing, in my opinion. This is part of what you get by belonging to an institute of this sort. Any thoughts or comments about what I've been talking about? Yes.
I heard that physicians were going to start being tested for competency.
Well, in a way they are. I mean, my daughter is a family practice doctor. Physicians being tested for competency. In a way they are. My daughter is in Arizona. She's a family practice doctor. And every 7 years, she has to retake her boards. And she doesn't like it. I don't blame her. She has to study really hard. She just took them recently and passed them all. But yeah, I mean, the intellectual part is one piece of it. But then there's the health part. That's a piece of it. I mean, if you become so unhealthy that you end up being a harm to your patients, that's an issue too. Are you fit to practice? Not just intellectually, but emotionally, health-wise, sure. Anything else? Okay. Writing an ethical will. How many of you know what an ethical will is? Have any of you written one?
I'm looking on in my head.
All right, what will be a part of your ethical will? What do you want to pass on as your values to the next generation, to your survivors?
My sense of a commitment to being connected to my life, and cultivating a deep personal honesty, things like that.
Now, you mentioned that you had, are you a student of Zen?
I'm a Zen priest.
You're a Zen priest. So how important would it be to pass on the values of Zen through an ethical will?
Important, not in the sense of passing on some sectarian beliefs of some kind, but in the sense of passing on a kind of an approach to living life.
Okay.
And trying to articulate that and put it down on paper in a way that would be accessible to the people that come after me in terms of understanding me and my life and what was important to me.
Okay.
I think it's something like that.
And would any of your practices be important to pass on, meditation or other things of that sort, or not so much?
Only in the sense that they have been of value to me, not in the sense of trying to proselytize or convince somebody else to follow that.
Okay. One thing I've known, one of my a colleague at the University of Pennsylvania who is also here at Stanford, Mickey Stunkert, who is a psychiatrist and learned Zen during the occupation of Japan. He's he's in his 90s now. But I found Mickey, he was a very interesting guy. He was one of the founders, consultants of the founding of Weight Watchers. And he believed, he took this from Zen, that you should focus on your eating, just be one mind at one point as you eat, and really focus on what you're eating and enjoy every morsel, essentially. Don't do it in a mindless way. But one thing I saw about Mickey is that he tended to be a very spontaneous person. he almost, well, yeah, I guess I could call it that. He seemed to really be in touch with his intuitive, what we call his intuitive function.
Able to respond in the moment.
In the moment.
Effectively.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know if you can, I mean, that can be passed on by example more than by words, I think.
Okay. That I think is probably true. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Ethical wills. Does anyone else have an idea about what they would want to put in their ethical will? If they want an ethical will, what do you want to pass on? What means something to you, aside from your material possessions? I mean, they're important, but what values would you like to pass on to the next generation? Now, I can imagine passing on values concerning, well, all right, as a Jungian, what do we value? What do we value? We value, if you look at the stages of analysis, we value shadow. We value coming to terms with those things we would rather not be, right? That's a simple way of putting it. We want to become more consciously aware. As Joseph Henderson put it, I heard him say this several times, you can tell that individuation is continuing if a person continues to work with shadow. Mm-hmm. Because part of what shadow is what we're not consciously aware of. So you continue to work with this. You continue to be open to it. So I can imagine in an ethical will writing about the importance of being open to these things that we're not ordinarily conscious of. Okay? The other thing that Jung talked about, and this is one of the stages of analytic work, is coming to terms with the contrasexual archetype, anima animus. Well, what does that mean in actual life? Well, it means becoming a more related person, being able to tune in to other people. I would say passing on the value of empathy. That's a good thing to pass on to children and your survivors, that you value empathy, you value relatedness, you value things that allow people to connect. Now, Jung, one of his big regrets at the end of his life is that he hadn't developed this more fully. Jung was a difficult guy. He was a genius, there's no question. The guy was a genius. But he could be a tough guy to connect with. I heard stories from Frau Jaffing about what it was like to be in analysis with him. Well, at that time I had hair that would curl my hair. And I thought, gee, I could never do an analysis with him. Thank God I'm one step removed and I'm doing analysis with you. Because he was just, he could have these storms, and it would be as a storm hit, and then you had to wait for the storm to pass. And he did some things that were a little bit, I won't repeat them, but not too nice. No. I mean, it's the same story with, I'm sure there's stories in the Zen community about masters and priests and who did some unnice things. We know that. But there's no question about it. He realized that this was a shortcoming for him. He wasn't as related as he could have been. So that was one piece. That would be one piece that I would pass on in ethical will, the importance of being connected. I would also pass on the importance of being curious. I think curiosity is a good thing. I'm scientifically oriented. Scientists are curious by nature, I hope. And, always being at the cutting edge and seeing what's new and what's interesting. Yeah, and I think my children actually pick some of that up from me. They see that in me. I'm on LinkedIn, and one fellow who's known me he says he's known me since the age of 12, so that means 56 years. I don't think I was that young than that, but he said, I was always a curious person. He said, I was always interested in trying different things. I was also always persevering. Well, I like those values. Those are values I would pass on. He sees that in me. He sees that in me over many years. So, yeah, I'd like to pass that on to my children. Yes?
The word that comes up for me is authenticity.
Authenticity is important. Absolutely. Authenticity is very important. Being who you really are.
No matter what other people think or feel about it.
And that's hard. And, you know, this is part of being in touch with the shadow side, because if you're not aware of the side of yourself, how can you be authentic? You know, if you think you're one way, but it's very clear that you're another, and other people can see that. Often you have trouble seeing your own shadow side. Other people can see it, especially people who know you well and intimately. If you want to know about a person's shadow, ask their spouse. Spouse knows. Yeah. Sure. Authenticity is very important. I agree. That would be something I would put in an ethical rule. Sure. Yes, sir.
I'm thinking that writing an ethical will might help one to live a more ethical life.
I think you're right.
An example comes from my grandmother, who died when I was in medical school. She had been, she liked boys and men. She didn't like girls and women. And she had two stepdaughters that she inherited with marriage to my grandfather. Then had two sons who had sons. And she had a couple of granddaughters in the mix from her daughters, her stepdaughters. And she did not treat them nicely during her life. She wrote a letter which was revealed after her death, where she apologized for her shadowy behavior towards women in her life. She was aware of it, but she did not, unfortunately, I don't know when she wrote this letter, how many years before her death. I was really impressed that she was aware of it, but it was sad to me that she hadn't been able to individuate with that knowledge in her relationships with her stepdaughters. And I imagine it didn't have quite the same impact on them that it did on me. Being aware that she could be conscious of this after the fact.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense.
Much harm done.
Much harm done. How to put it? We're all human, and I don't know of too many saints. Thank goodness. I've heard that saints can be very difficult to live with. But we try to do the best we can. We try to keep improving. And the ethical, as analysts, as therapists, we want to be very careful in our work with our patients and analysis, not to harm them. Now, if we commit an empathic failure, which is easy enough to do, we want to somehow repair that in the work. We don't want to leave people worse off than they were before they came in to see us. That's our duty. And that's important. One of the first, and I learned this firsthand, one of the first analytic experience I had, where I was on the couch with a psychiatrist named Jules Masserman. Now, some of you know about him. There was a movie made about him, You Must Be Dreaming. Judge Hirsch played Jules Masserman. He was a despicable guy. He was brilliant. He won the Lasker Award in medicine. He was a brilliant guy. He was co-chair of the Department of Psychiatry at Northwestern. But he was terrible. And thank goodness I was only 25 when I started with him, and I had the wherewithal to leave a year later. And it wasn't easy, because he was the great man, and what was I? I was, this speck, as it were, in comparison to the great man. But he did terribly. He injured me deeply, and it took me 7 years before I would go back into therapy again. You hear this in the stories of patients who are abused sexually or otherwise by their therapists, taken advantage of one way or another. This is an awful thing. And it's unethical, and it's harmful, and it goes against the spirit of the sort of work we're doing. Now, there are times when we make mistakes, and we have to come to terms with those and try to remedy them with our patients and our sons. And we have to be as consciously aware of what we're doing as we're doing it. And if need be, we have to get consults from our colleagues and others. And whenever possible, if we do commit an empathic failure or worse, we have to try to rectify the situation. It's incumbent on us. Okay. Okay. All right. Thoughts about life and death, reflections about the meaning of death. Okay. One thing, so there's the ethical will. What about, how many of you have written your own obituary? There's a few. That's a very useful exercise. And I go one step further. Write your own obituary and then share it with the people close to you and see what they think about it and what they would add or subtract or change. That's very helpful to do. It sort of focuses the mind, as it were. So I've done that a couple of times, and I've shared it with some of the people close to me. And sometimes I'm surprised to hear what I get in return. It's not that different from sharing your will. When you write a will and you share it with the people close to you, sometimes you can be surprised by the sort of response you're going to get. It can be helpful to your development as a person to get that out. And now you're getting down to it, aren't you? When you share things like the obituary you've written, your will, your ethical will, you're sharing these things whenever possible with people who are close to you, who are connected to you, who have meaning to you. You're developing what Jung would say is your feeling function. This is an important part of individuation. It's not all apart from your relationships with others. That's an important part of individuating, is doing this sort of work with other people. Okay. I have to interject something here because it's getting a little bit heavy too. Have any of you seen the Monty Python movie, The Meaning of Life? Oh my God, it's a couple. Yeah. So that's a funny movie. And it's the idea, I won't say how it starts, but the idea is they Monty Python, this British group of overeducated comedians. I think they're Oxford. I think they're from Oxford, maybe Cambridge too. But they have a take on what's meaningful in life. They have different versions of it, and it's really funny. I mean, if you like that sort of thing, it's almost as funny as The Black Knight. But it's very fun, and there are a couple of scenes in there that are outrageous. I mean, one is this gourmand goes into a restaurant and orders, he's huge, and he orders everything that's on the menu, and he has a big bucket there next to him. He's throwing all the shells and everything else, and finally he just can't eat it. And the maitre d' comes up to him and says, "I have the thinnest little mint." And the fellow says, "No, I can't. If I eat anything else, I'll explode. I can't eat it." Well, this goes on for a while. And finally, the maitre d' convinces him, persuades him to take the thinnest little mint, which he does, and whereupon he literally explodes. And it's all over the screen. I mean, but it's funny. You have to see it to appreciate it. Obviously, for some people, what's most important in life is sating all the senses. Now I'm going to stop sounding a little bit Buddhist. The most important thing is to eat as much as possible, to be like Justin Bieber, I guess.
Hopefully not.
To imbibe all that you can, to experience everything to an excess. And that's one way of viewing it, and certainly it's covered in the Monty Python movie. in the scene. But there are other ways of experiencing life's meaning. How do you experience, what is meaningful to you as you go on in life and approach what will be your inevitable death? What sort of mark would you like to leave behind? What would be your legacy, as it were? What would you like to be your legacy? Have you given any thought to that? Yes.
That she loved well.
And what does that mean?
What did you say? That she loved well. That that I tended to my relationships with people and that they mattered, and that the people that were in my life felt my love, and that I was able to not only extend it but to receive it.
Okay. And how would you know that before you died?
I think by the quality of relationships that I have cultivated through my lifetime, and the depth of connection that is there.
Okay.
That I would feel.
Would you ever enter into a dialogue with these important people in your life around these issues?
Yes, probably throughout the relationship, but absolutely in the completion of it.
Okay. Okay. Any other thoughts or reflections on this? What sort of legacy do you want to leave? What would make your life a meaningful one? How could you look at your life at the end and say, well, you know, I did something important, I did something meaningful to me. And it's good that I was on this earth for this brief period of time. Yes?
This may just be a matter of semantics, but legacy and meaning are separate things to me, or at least maybe it's a continuum.
All right.
Because while I'm still living, the issue of what is meaningful to me is a continuing thing, rather apart from a legacy per se.
Okay. Well, all right. So pick one of the two, and can you address what would be what you would like to leave that would be meaningful?
Well, again, I'm not thinking about what I'm leaving. I'm thinking about what I'm doing now.
Okay.
I'm thinking about the present more.
Okay.
And I'm not sure about this, but I suspect that if I'm able to have a meaningful life, the legacy will follow. And you know, it's not. I'm with Woody Allen. I don't want to live through my work. I want to just not die.
Well, you know, people sometimes plan their legacies. So, for example, here at the Jung Institute, we encourage our analyst members to think about these issues and to start planning their wills and so on to leave a legacy to the Institute. We do that. We say, you know, at our dinner meetings, apparently some of our analyst members and others are leaving legacies to the Institute, which they plan to do while they're living.
Right. Okay, I see what you're saying. A legacy in terms of, you know, I've just revised my trust, and who am I going to leave my money to?
That's
and
sure.
And what kind of charities or institutions or whatever. Yes, that. I see what you're saying. That's a different thing.
Yeah, and for example, the Institute isn't the only place that does this. KQED and other places do this sort of thing. And they ask you, they even have arrangements. I'm certainly no financial planner, but they have arrangements so that you can do this and get income while you're still alive. But then you leave the bulk of the money to the place. Look, money in our society is a big issue. There's no question. That's part of it. But what sort of... So, all right, I talked about Hal Bott. Hal continued as the clinic director for 33 years. He and I talked about this. He thought he was going to live longer. He did. But he realized he was creating a legacy at the Institute through the work in the clinic. He knew this. And this was important to him. This became a major source of psychic investment for him. And he did a real, I mean, there are a lot of people, including this person, who feel very grateful to Hal for what he did. I mean, he created something of real benefit, not just for the Institute and the interns, but for the wider community. That's a wonderful thing that he did. And he was consciously aware of creating a legacy as he did it. Jung, in his own way, created a legacy through his work, through the Institute. Now, there's some question as to which institute was founded first, the Zurich Institute or the San Francisco Institute. They were both created around the same time. But Jung didn't want to do this originally. Remember, Jung's, one of his inferior, I would say it was his inferior function, was his feeling function, even more so than sensation. He had to be persuaded into doing this by Yolanda Jacobi. She's the force who caused Jung to create the Institute in Zurich. And it's a real legacy that he's left behind. The Institute in Zurich, it's actually split, but when I was there are about 400 students there from all over the world. And they came to study at the place that Jung founded. That was something that he did somewhat against his will, but he did it. Just as another legacy he left was his book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. I would assume most of you have read this. He referred to it as Frau Jaffe's project. It's a combination of a biography, autobiography. She had to talk him into doing this. And it's the most popular book of anything he's written. It's much more popular than any of the collected works. I don't know about you, but that's how I came in touch with Jung, was through that book. I came in touch with Jung through that book and through June Singer's book, Boundaries of the Soul. It was those two books that got me I read them and I thought, oh, this really resonates with me. So, in a way, Frau Jaffe, working with Jung, left her legacy. And oddly enough, Frau Jaffe told me that she was given the royalties for the book. This is what supported her in the later years of her life, with royalties from Memories, Dreams, Reflections. He was good to her in that way, and Jung was. I mean, Frau Jaffe did a lot of things for Jung in terms of helping him with issues around his own publications and so on. She put a face on Jung that was had more feeling to it than he could exhibit himself. Yes?
As you talk about legacy, and as we're talking, it sounds like we're talking about things that we have done that can be passed on. And I'm wondering if they're in a more, maybe it's a more spiritual sense, but if there's a way of being that is a legacy that isn't measurable or tangible, or actually isn't something that has been done, but has been something that is a part of one's existence that makes the difference, and actually may continue in ways we can't measure.
I think that makes sense. Yes, I think there's something to that. I would. Frau Jaffe was, in my opinion, great because of the way she was, her being, not in terms of what she did. She worked with Jung, but she didn't make a name for herself. She did in a way, but she was great in my mind because of the person she was, the way she embodied certain values, the way she could be with me. She could be with me in a certain way. There weren't any fancy interventions. Of course, we worked with my dreams and other things, but she didn't sit there trying to employ certain strategies. It was her being. It was her personhood that made all the difference, just being who she was. That's important. That's very important in analytic work. It's I would say it's the most important part. It's the being, it's the personhood of the analyst, rather than what the analyst does or doesn't do. Now, don't get me wrong, there are things that an analyst can do that could be very hurtful to a patient, and those should be avoided. But so someone like Frau Jaffe, it would never even cross her mind to be with me in a way that was harmful, for example. That just wasn't who she was. So I would say her legacy was more in her being than in her doing. I would agree with that. Yes, someone else had it. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to. I wanted to take that, see if we could spin that a little bit further out. When I hear conversations about legacy, I hear conversations about sort of the egoic function.
Okay.
What I am doing, how I am being.
Okay.
And certainly for me, that whatever legacy might happen comes out of my relationships with my clients, with my friends, and so forth. That's. It isn't that I haven't written the books. It isn't that I haven't published the articles. Blah 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 blah.
Right.
When I did that, I was very focused on building a person.
Okay.
I've been in a dying process for over a decade now, and I am fairly clearly looking at it in the next couple of years.
Okay.
And what I'm looking at is separating all the stuff that does legacy, all the stuff that builds a person, insofar as I'm able to do that. And I don't know how can the brain not think? How can the brain think without using the brain? How can I think about separating from me? But that's really a different form. That takes me away from the whole concept of legacy.
Okay.
At least as I'm understanding. Into a different order of individuation. A letting go of those boundaries.
Okay.
So I'm very attracted to the notion of the myth now, of what my myth is of dying.
Well, what do you imagine your myth is? Have you ever?
Oh yeah.
Are you willing to share it? Or
Sure. My left brain is very clear that we all die and so forth. My right brain, however, remembers all the meetings with people and saying, "Oh, it's you." How by resolving a fantasy of my relationship with my father, my mother believed that because my father put his knife and fork down the cross, he had been a monk in a 13th century monastery. And at one point I said, okay, let's play with this, because I had a very troubled relationship with my father for a long time, quite nicely resolved eventually. But what I saw was, if that were true, then he was the abbot and I was the rebellious monk. And if I could heal things now, I could heal them all the way back to there.
Okay.
I did heal them.
Okay.
And we had a fine, shallow, but fine relationship the rest of his life, as far as deep as he was willing to go. And we were great. So I take on the myth of the person I regard as my spiritual counselor, who's my ex-primary partner. That we chose this. And if there's an opportunity, we'll choose something else. And what do we make of that choice? Before I was diagnosed with cancer a decade past, I was doing a lot of meditations at night, imagining myself dead. I had no idea consciously that this was coming, but I was doing meditations every night for about half an hour, seeing how much I could disappear, how much I could be gone. So that was part of it.
Okay.
Am I answering your question?
Well, I mean, this is part of your myth. That's what you're telling.
Yes.
Okay. If you were going to put a title to your myth, what would it be?
Telling the truth.
Telling the truth. Being here now, telling the truth. Okay.
And really, if I could leave that, if my nephew could get that from me and think about it the rest of his life, I would in a life I do not now have, regard myself as successful.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. All right. That makes sense.
You know, tell the truth, keep your agreements and don't fuck people up.
It sounds like a worthwhile myth to me. Especially as these myths, these myths we form, there's a reality basis to them. They're not, we have a pejorative sense of the word myth in our society, but Jung had a myth. Frau Jaffe wrote about it. She called it, in her book, she has a book out that's worth reading called The Myth of Meaning. And she talks about Jung's myth and how Jung found meaning in things. This was really important to him. And it was more important. This is how she labeled his myth. Yes, I'll leave it at that.
So my myth involves all my component personas. I've done a lot of work on normal dissociation with myself and with others. And taking a look at all the component pieces of me and how they blend into the river that gets presented. They all participate in it. The little kids and the girls and the lion and all the Ganesh and all, they all participate in it. Does that help?
It could. I'm not sure where you draw the line between what you're doing and active imagination. Have you ever done active imagination?
I have done active imagination. I didn't deliberately set out to find these folks.
No.
They appeared in different ways, in different contexts.
Sure.
And the conscious work was all of us becoming a unified family.
Okay. That sounds good. I mean, in a real active imagination, there's a dialogue between.
There's always dialogue. They're all here. We're all here now. We're all.
Sounds good. Yeah. So it isn't a fantasy, quote unquote, being imposed by your ego, as it were.
No, it's discovery, and who knows if it's real.
Why not? I mean, there is such a thing as psychic reality.
It's real for me.
It's real for you. In your own mind, it's real. That's important, no question. And often, through active imagination, what you do can have an impact on your outer life. There's no question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, from a functional standpoint, you could say, well, what you're doing is real because it's maybe happening in your mind, but we see the consequences in your outer life, in your relationships with others, and the way you comport yourself. Why not? Makes sense to me. Yeah. Yes, Beth.
We're talking almost as if there is a split between the mind and the behavior, the mind and the outside world, the inner and the outer world. But it seems that it's all part of one. It's just perhaps two sides. So I'm a little confused isn't a word, but it seems like we're making a distinction that may be an artificial one.
Okay. Yeah. Well, there can be, how to put it, the mind and body are not always split. They can come together. I'll agree with that. It depends on, in part, you remember these defenses we were talking about?
Yes.
It depends on that in part. I mean, there can be a lot of illusion, too, in this sort of work. That's why it's helpful at some point or another to work with another person who can help you to see. I mean, in almost all of the spiritual practices and in-depth psychological work, at some points along the way, you work with a teacher, an analyst, a spiritual advisor, maybe more than one. It's important to be able to see beyond the illusions we create for ourselves, too. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Just a second.
Emotional. But to me, the work I've done on myself to change cultural patterns and to change family patterns, to me, that's a legacy. And to me, that's part of the individuation process.
That's a good point.
And to me, maybe it's wishful thinking, but I think it changes the collective unconscious.
I agree.
And also the transcendent function.
Sure.
So to work with these, I always, I think a lot about whether it's wishful thinking or not.
Sure.
Whether if we really are changing something or not, or how much effect does it have.
Sure.
But anyway, for me personally, with my family and whatnot, and my neighbors, that's my legacy.
I think that you're touching on something important here. That the work we do on ourselves, by coming to terms with our complexes, by becoming more consciously aware, by integrating ourselves more, that will have an effect. And in some families, we therapists see this a lot. If you trace it back far enough, let's call it a family legacy. It's passed on from generation to generation. Often, it's very dysfunctional and abusive. And it happens unconsciously. It goes from the Bible talks, about 7 generations? Something like that. These things get passed along, and nobody becomes consciously aware and says enough. Nobody stands up or does his or her own work in order to get beyond this. I think that's an invaluable legacy. Yes.
In Native American, in many Native American way, the belief is that the 7 generations into the past, as well as the 7 generations into the future, are changed as a result of us at this moment in time changing the legacy or changing the story, doing the work of healing. Right. And that's the healing that we do for and with ourselves is extended and affects all those generations from the past as well, regardless of what realm.
Okay.
And that has been a very heartening belief for me in terms of the level of commitment it takes to heal and become more awake in my own life.
Okay.
That I'm doing this not only for myself, but for my people.
Okay. Let's take a break. It's 20 after for 10 minutes, then we'll come back and we'll continue on. We'll go into the intuitive realm and we'll have a lot of fun. So let's move on to intuition. The mystery of life, the mystery of death, origins and destinations as reflected in dreams, active imaginations, and spiritual musings. What is your myth about death and dying? Now, if you remember, I said that when I was a 7-year-old after my grandmother died, I was lying in bed wondering, where was I before I was alive? And where will I be after I die? Then I put that last one out of my mind. But now it's become a sort of, music for me. I wonder about this. I do meditate. I wonder before and after I meditate, where will I be after I die? And I wrestle with this. And I can't say that I've come up with any answer to it, but it's an important part of my own process of coming to terms. And it doesn't scare me the way it did before. That's one difference. I'm not frightened by the question. As a matter of fact, I've gone one step further, and you see, I don't know if we'll have time to do this. I almost need a whole separate course to talk about this, developing the capacity to not know. And that, I've been working on that from a Jungian perspective. That, to me, is an important part of the individuation process, to be able to live with uncertainty, to be able to wait for things to emerge without trying to force them one way or another. Jung talks about this in terms of kairos, waiting for the moment that is right, not trying to force issues, let them be, let them come forth. This, to me, is part of the capacity to not know. But we won't get into that too much today. That'll be for another time. What Jung says and this is what he says on the importance of developing a myth of facing death. At the time of this dream, the lady was afraid of death and did her best to fend off any thoughts about it. Yet death is an important interest, especially to an aging person. The categorical question is being put to him, and he is under an obligation to answer it. To this end, he ought to, or she ought to, have a myth about death. For reason shows him nothing but the dark pit into which he is descending. Myth, however, can conjure up other images for him, helpful and enriching pictures of life in the land of the dead. If he believes in them or greets them with some measure of credence, he is being just as right or just as wrong as someone who does not believe in them. But while the man who despairs marches toward nothingness, the one who has placed his faith in the archetype follows the tracks of life and lives right into his death. Both, to be sure, remain in uncertainty, but the one goes against his instincts, the other with them. This is from Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Now, so in a way, it's following the archetype as it's expressed to you. I mean, my experience of the archetype is going to be different from your experience of the archetype. My dreams are going to be different from your dreams. My experiences through active imagination will be different from yours. So it's the idea of following and finding your own myth, and following the archetype as it presents itself to you, for you. And it may be that it's unique to you. It may be you're here, you're having a life experience different from mine, so presumably the way the archetype is expressing itself is different for you from the way it is for me. Does that make sense? Yeah. So and then I'll go on a little bit with what I've been drawn to. What to you makes sense? How have you been able to follow your myth or create your myth by following the archetype? Any thoughts about that? Yes.
One thought is that I had a very close friend at 16 that decided to die.
Okay.
And she had multiple health issues. She was in pain.
Right.
And then she had to have an amputation and then go on dialysis. So she could have lived.
Okay.
But she decided to die.
Uh-huh.
And it took her about 2 weeks.
Uh-huh.
And she then first gave away lots of things, invited her closest friends over.
Mm.
And then she invited the Vipassana community in Santa Cruz to come and sit with her lightly as she went through the dying process. And so she gave the community that gift.
Okay.
And the community came over and sat with her. One night, when I was sitting with her, I had the image of an old Indian woman weaving a carpet, like the Navajo carpets. And I saw the old woman's hands working on the one last thread, the thread of the eternal. And that was her last thread that needed to be connected before she died. And so that, to me, is a living myth.
Following her archetype, creating her myth as she went into death.
For the spider, regular spider
Yeah.
archetype. And then also when we talked at the
Right.
break, it's been about 20 years ago since I read Anne France's book,
Right.
Dreams Before Dying.
Right.
And so my memory is not that good, but on the book. But what is coming to me is that there was a stone. One of the images was a stone that had been on fire. It was red, but it wasn't hot. And trees in the woods that had burned, but didn't burn from dreams. So that's, I don't know if anybody's recently read that book of it, dreams, but something of the eternal that remains in images and dreams. So that's what I
Okay.
comment on.
So how has her experience and the experience you've had since reading about France, how has that affected the way you follow the archetype and create your own myth? Has it?
Well, I think in the Spider Woman and Grandmother Spider for the Navajo and Hopi, and the creatress, and there was close friends out to Spider Rock and Canyon de Chelly and the birthplace of Grandmother Spider, and the thread of the eternal, and connecting with that. And then we're weaving, she's weaving and we're weaving our lives, but there's an eternal thread to it. So that's about as close as I can get. I mean, I have other thoughts on it, but that is very meaningful to me.
Do you follow your dreams? Do you stay in touch with your dreams?
Yes, I follow my dreams, and the whole, what's meaningful to me, I've come across a Japanese myth that I'm working to interpret, and I've done long-term work with women that have been sexually abused, 25 years, 30 years, long-term depth psychotherapy, Jungian-oriented. And so I've come across this Japanese myth that also has a weaver there. And then I see images of sexual abuse and healing from sexual abuse. So that feels very meaningful to me to work on right now as well. So I don't know how it's all, I don't have it all sorted through, but those are pieces of it.
No, I would say from my experience, my personal and professional experience, it's important to be able to resonate with the material that you're, it has to be really connected to you, and it sounds as though this is. That's important. And authentic. It has to feel authentic to you. So, as I mentioned in here, when I worked with Frau Jaffe, Kabbalah was very important to me. My Jewishness was very important to me. I changed my name. Part of what my name change was about was recovering a part of myself that had been deeply wounded in high school, where I ran into virulent anti-Semitism. And I had identified with the aggressor. That's another defense that Freud talks about. And in my analysis, I was recovering that part and re-owning it. And that had a lot to do with the name change. And so when I continued with Frau Jaffe, she was raised a Jew. She had gone to medical school, I think, in Frankfurt, and she was ready to get her MD degree when Hitler came to power. In Germany, in order for a person to get the MD degree, they have to take an oral exam. They have to write a thesis, the medical student, and then defend it. Hitler had just come to power. She was showing up for orals, and in order to gain admittance, she had to do the Hitler salute, Sieg Heil, and she refused to do it. So she never got her MD degree. And things like that you couldn't transfer from one institution to another very easily. So luckily she was married to a fellow named Dreyfus, who was a world-class physicist, and they left for Geneva, and eventually she found a way to Zurich. But I worked with re-owning that part, and Kabbalah really resonated with me at that time. But then after I left, and these things can change over time. After I left Zurich, she died in 1991 and so on, and it sort of drifted into the background, and I become more interested in Ikkyu and Zen issues that my patients bring to me. A number of my patients are Jewish and Buddhist, what it's called, Jubu, right? And so that's, Jung often said you have to be open to what's going on, what your patients bring to you. You can't just impose, and that's true. And so things have changed for me. And so I found one of my patients knew about my interest in death and dying, and he sent me these poems by Ikkyu, which were just astounding, the way they resonated. I mean, they grabbed me in my guts. That's the only way I can put it. And so I started reading everything I could by him, and I started having dreams that were related to this. And I remembered my question, which I had been repeating to myself. I won't say it was a koan, but it was my version of one. Where will I be after I die? And I was wrestling with it. And I came across a number of things that really appealed to me. And Ikkyu, and he was a very controversial guy, but then again, Jung was too. I seem to be drawn to controversial people. He was an amazing, creative character, but a bit of a unconventional Zen monk. In his death portrait, he was pictured with his lover of 11 years, Mori, and this was never done before. And he was the first to do it. In his lineage, everyone marries, all the Zen monks, and this often is not the case. But his lineage is still in existence in Daitakoji, outside of Kyoto. And I wrote some things that he read. As I said, I'm drawn to the ideas and death poetry of Zen Buddhism, in particular the creative work of Ikkyu, One Pause, an unconventional and highly creative Zen monk who lived from 1394 to 1481 in and around Kyoto. I might point out that his calligraphy is collected by the titans of industry in Japan. It's fabulously expensive. He was a very creative character. Calligraphy, poetry, no theater, any number of things. And he had something to do with the beginnings of the Japanese tea ceremony. Here are two poems. One is a death poem by the Chinese Zen master Kido Chigun, who was one of Ikkyu's guiding lights. The other, a death poem by Ikkyu in response to Kido. It's not uncommon. I don't know if this is the case here and now in this country nowadays, but back in his time anyway, the Zen master would write his death poem. It's still true? Okay. So Kido's poem, which I really like a lot, is coming from nowhere, departing from nowhere, a flashing glance, entering the mystery. That really appeals to me. Ikkyu's response, and you have to remember that this was, Kido was his guiding light. He said, south of Mount Sumeru, who can understand my Zen? Even if Kido should come alive again, he's not worth half a penny. And I go on to say, why would Ikkyu appear to be so dismissive about his mentor's last pearls of wisdom? Here is the analysis of the authors of Unraveling Zen's Red Thread, one a Western female academic who for years had studied and written about Ikkyu, and the other the 26th Zen abbot of Ikkyu's memorial temple in Daitakoji, Kyoto. As he faced death's actuality, Ikkyu stated that even Kido's brand of Zen would now be valueless. No one else's type of Zen would matter a hoot to him because it would be foreign. Each individual's personal belief system through Zen was the best possible for him or her. Thus, Ikkyu entered the realm of death with no doubts as to the depth or correctness of his own Zen. For him, there is a slight hint of bravado that comes through the ideographs that he brushed on his paper. No one else ever wrote a death poem quite like it. Surely Ikkyu knew that his disciples would carefully preserve what he wrote. Now it's me talking. My sense is that by substituting personal myth for Zen in the previous analysis, I would arrive at the same position that Jung articulates in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, namely that each individual must find his or her own personal myth about death. I must too. And then I go on, and I say the elements of my personal myth, an exit transitional object in the form of a titanium cremation urn. The urn was created via active imagination following the death of my mother in 2002 and laser engraved with the image of the snail and Isa's haiku, "O snail, climb Mount Fuji, but slowly, slowly." The snail is my spirit animal. It emerged in my initial dream in Jungian analysis with David L. Hart in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, around 1978. I might also say that in that, I'm not going to go into the dream, it's pretty dramatic. In that dream, and Jung, by the way, privileges initial dreams. He says basically they have both a diagnostic and prognostic quality. In that dream, the snail became the carrier of my conscious awareness. It was just amazing. And by the way, when I had that dream, I had no idea about the Jung Institute or the snail logo of the Jung Institute. That's a happy coincidence or synchronicity. The second element, a temenos, a sacred and safe place in the form of a niche for my titanium urn at the columbarium. Third, a pre-death ritual of inviting my family, friends, and colleagues who accompany me to my niche and touch base with it before repairing to a restaurant for breaking bread and enjoying life together. I see two people here. I definitely engaged in that way as part of it. 3, a prearranged memorial service following my actual death in the central place of the columbarium, for which I have specified many but not all of the details. For example, playing the Beatles song, Here Comes the Sun. I mean, that is the most moving song. And adorning the place with California poppies. I visit the columbarium several times a month and meditate next to my niche. Emmett, the caretaker of the place for many years, refers to me as Snail Man. Yeah, Emmett's a character. I don't know if any of you know of him. He's been the caretaker there for at least 25 years. When I conjure up that image in my mind's eye, I experience a profound sense of serenity of being at home. And for me, home goes back, being at home, being in a safe, contained place is a very important part of what I've sought my whole life. In a way, by coming to this institute, I was seeking home, and I found it here. I should say, back in 1988, I attended a dinner meeting at this institute, and I sat next to Arthur Coleman, who's no longer a member, unfortunately, and we just had the greatest time, and I felt so connected and contained. And one of the practices we follow very diligently at this institute is the monthly dinner meetings. And it may be one reason why there have been no splits in our institute. There is that thought that other institutes don't have this ritual of the monthly dinner meeting. We do. We break bread together. We share it together, we connect together. I think it could be, now it's not always, there can be problems, don't get me wrong, but on the whole, it serves a very useful function. So for me, finding home was a very important part of my myth. And I feel that here at this institute. I feel it through the snail logo. I feel it through this building. I feel it through my colleagues. I feel it through being in the San Francisco area. It's a deep connection. I can't imagine being anywhere else. And I came here quite consciously. I didn't just end up here unconsciously. This took a lot of conscious intent and unconscious intent on my part. So what sort of, and we'll talk about developing the capacity to not know in a minute, what sort of myths can you imagine for yourself? Yes, I'll look in the mic.
Well, actually, I think I'm more in the process of discovering the myth.
Okay.
And there was a workshop I went to on death within the last couple of years, and we were left with 2 questions at the end.
Okay.
Who does your soul want you to be, and what does your soul want you to do?
Okay.
Here I am in the last phase of my life, and I was really knocked over by those questions. And I thought, well, that's what I've got to discover before I die. Okay. And so I'm in that process of just letting my inner life play a bigger part in my outer life, and letting myself feel my soul and try to live out of that. And so in that process, I'm gradually beginning to get a sense of the meaning of my life. Mm-hmm. And when you were talking earlier about legacy, the meaning of my life, I think is what I leave with those who are connected to me. Okay. And hopefully it will reflect in the meaning of their lives, and will be carried on in that way. So I'm in the process of kind of discovering, well, what is my myth, and is there an archetype there? And I don't have that yet, but I feel it coming as I'm on this journey that I see as the last part of my life. And I sort of have that feeling I'll get to a place where it's like, okay, I'm ready now. I'm ready to go. Mm-hmm. And I have a sense that there'll be some sense of fulfillment that I'll have that'll say, I'm ready to go.
Okay, I can appreciate that. Yeah. Yes, sir.
There was a Kirk Douglas movie,
okay,
in which he is the leader of the Vikings. And he comes to England and has many battles with the English. And at the end, he is stabbed by one of the Englishmen that's lying on this big rock, dying. And he realizes that he needs his sword in his hand before he dies. So he reaches and he scrapes. And the guys are sitting there letting him do this himself. He grasps the sword. He looks at it as the sun is shining down on him. He dies. The sword falls on the rocks and clatters down. And I saw that movie when I was about 10. I've always remembered that as being a good death. It's not a peaceful death.
No.
I want to ask whether this is less good, less mature than, because you had terror before
of the defenses.
Oh. So this myth, of which there are many like this, lots of fairy tales like this, I think also play a role for a lot of people. It's not the kind of everybody sitting down in a quiet room death, but it does.
I mean, in fairy tales, often things aren't quiet and peaceful, and there aren't always happy endings, let's put it that way. Often, at the end of a fairy tale, there's a big piece of unfinished business that has to be addressed sometime later. That happens in fairy tales a lot. Yes, ma'am?
I was just going to say, in response to that, to the movie that you were describing about it being an appropriate image. It depends on how we perceive the warrior and the hero.
Okay.
And that could be very much a part of a myth, a personal myth.
Absolutely. Sure. And I would say there are good warriors and bad warriors. It's like anything else. There are good people and bad people. That's putting it simply. But sure, I mean, a myth of that sort can be very enriching and meaningful.
Well, because you talk about legacies,
right?
And there's so much injustice and corruption,
right?
And downtrodden people in this world.
Sure.
We need to I mean, legacy. I guess this is kind of legacy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to die happily if you're out there trying to accomplish that sort of thing.
Well, I think as we get older, we learn to exercise more discernment. What battles are worth fighting? Let's put it that way. We pick our battles carefully. Now, it may be for the Kirk Douglas character, this was the central motif of his life, and he had to do this. That's fine, but for many of us, we have to be careful about what battles we fight, what battles we don't. And sometimes, what's the phrase? Discretion is the better part of valor. Sometimes courage is not fighting. Sometimes the easiest thing to do is to fight and to create trouble. Sometimes the better thing is not to fight. How to put it? Unfortunately, the world is an unfair place. I wish it weren't. I do what I can not to add to it, but who was it who said President Kennedy? John F. Kennedy, didn't he say life is unfair? One of the presidents made that statement. And it is unfair in a lot of ways. That we can do what we can to rectify injustices. We can do what we can to avoid adding to them. We can be more ethical in what we do. I mean, this, I think, is where an ethical will comes to bear. You're right. It helps to make you a better person when you sit down and work on something of that sort. But that doesn't mean that you have to fight every injustice. Wasn't that Don Quixote when tilting at windmills. That didn't serve him very well. And finally, at the end, he realized the folly of his ways. I can appreciate that. Yes, sir. Yeah.
But regardless, the warrior myth with which Douglas does and with which this gentleman identified speaks to an archetype regardless of the moral values of taking this battle or that battle.
Absolutely, it does. There's no question. You know, one of the points Jung made too about the archetype and about the ego position, and I think this is important. The question often comes up: should I just follow my unconscious blindly? Should I do, if something comes up from my unconscious, what should I do about this? And Frau Jaffe has written a lot about this. She said that before World War II and Jung's experience with the Nazis, he had what she called a romantic view of the world. And he was more inclined to give sway to the unconscious and just to follow it. And he learned from the Nazi experience. And he developed what she calls the classical position, like that. And that is where, and Jung writes about this too, the ego retains the responsibility for making ethical judgments. The things will come up from the unconscious. And then the ego, it doesn't abrogate responsibility and just follow blindly whatever comes up in a dream or in an active imagination. The ego position has to relate to the material and then make a decision about what to do. And sometimes, I wrote a paper about this some years ago, the importance of saying no to the self. Sometimes you have to say, no, I'm not going to do this. This is unethical, it's not right, and this is what I'm getting from the unconscious. But the unconscious is both good and bad. I mean, and then it's up to you as a person to make the decision about what you're going to do. You can't just follow these things blindly. Now, I think it's important to be open to what comes up from the unconscious, to allow your decisions to be informed by what comes up from the unconscious. Most definitely. But not to just go, if I have a dream and it says, well, you ought to go out and murder someone today, I'm not going to do that. I might wonder, why am I having this dream? What does this mean? What am I not consciously aware of? Thankfully, I've never had a dream like that. But I would try to understand it. And if I couldn't understand it on my own, I would go to one of my colleagues and talk about this dream and try to figure out what it meant and why it's coming now. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to go back to the warrior question, and what I was remembering is my favorite movie, The Seventh Seal, Ingmar Bergman's show. And so there's a warrior who comes back from the Crusades on the beach, right. And death appears, and the warrior says, "I'm not ready." And death says, "Everybody says that." and then they play chess, and the knight wins, and so he gets some more time. I like that as a myth. But the other thing I wanted to say about all these myths is it's really important not to reify them.
Sure.
And have them be, become a fantasy that then you try to live out, and etc. So having some consciousness and detachment from the myth while seeing its beauty and what it can reveal, I think is important. Yes.
As I said, Frau Jaffe referred to Jung's myth as the myth of meaning. So he found meaning in things. He gave us the concept of synchronicity, for example, acausal connections, meaningful acausal connections. This was a real addition to the world of thought, and some would say to the world of physics. There was at least one Nobel Prize-winning physicist who felt this way, Pauling, about what Jung had discovered. And this was Jung's myth, and he enacted the myth in a variety of ways that have been enriching for all of us. I mean, many of us are here because we follow in how to put it, we learn from Jung's myth. It's enriched our lives, informed our lives. It's meaningful to us, but we can't follow it blindly. We have to find our own myth, our own way as well. Anything else about myths, personal or otherwise? Okay. Do you know of anyone who has lived the last part of their life according to what seemed to be their myth? Have you encountered any? Yes.
Some of you may know this, but recently the abbot of San Francisco Zen Center died, and of a rapidly progressing illness. So I was at a meeting there in September, and I saw him, and he looked robust as usual. 2 weeks later, he was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and he died early on January 1st. And what he did was to share the process that he went through the whole time, from his decision to stop chemotherapy.
Okay.
And he did this in a series of letters, and also communications with one of his students who posted them on Facebook. And she asked him at one point, what teaching would you want me to pass on to my students that expresses your teaching? And he said, endless inquiry, and when you stop doing it, endless inquiry again. and then there was his written communication of his stepping down as abbot and turning over the responsibility to other people. And finally, there was his death poem. And so he completely connected with the whole process of his dying, and also shared it. It was as though he continued to teach. He taught us how to die. It was very, very beautiful.
Okay. So let me ask you, I've always been confused about some of the Buddha's teachings in this area. Did you feel a sense of loss when he died? Did you have a sense of attachment to him?
Yes, of course.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, because I've read, I don't know how accurate these readings are, what the Buddha experienced at the end of his life. Apparently he ate something that was bad or something of that sort. He was 80. And his followers started crying. This is what I've read.
Right.
And he basically said, "You're forgetting my teaching." So
yeah.
What do you make of that?
It's interesting, because I think that, sometime later historically there was perhaps can be considered a modification or a renewal of Buddhist teaching that's called the Mahayana, which is that you delay your own personal enlightenment until all beings are enlightened. And
right.
Zen is in that tradition, and so the way it has come down to me is that teaching is not body denying and not denying the human experience of loss and suffering.
Okay.
But turning towards it in a very deep and accepting way, much of what you're talking about today.
Right.
So that you experience life very deeply and the real losses, but you also realize that they are transient. So you're not overcome by them. You're participating in them. You're connected to them deeply and fully, living life deeply and fully, but with a kind of acceptance that's a kind of neutrality. It's a little hard to to describe this difference. So that's, I don't know what the Buddha said. Nobody really knows what the Buddha said, but that's more of what I've absorbed from the tradition.
Okay. Right. And from what I've read about Ikkyu, he's an unusual character. He would adopt sparrows and other small animals, and then when they died, he experienced real loss over
Absolutely.
there. Absolutely. And he would write about it in his poetry. He would also write, well, I'm not sure this is exactly what, something to that effect, exactly what I'm supposed to be, but this is what I've experienced. And he was true to his experience.
I mean, I think there's a deep acknowledgement and acceptance of the reality of the human experience.
Right.
That that includes really feeling loss, not turning away from it.
Right.
But in that acceptance is, there's a sort of poignancy of this is actually what it means to be a human being, and
right.
Deeply sad and moving as it is, and then within that acceptance, there's also a deep joy. It's not like enjoyment or fun, it's
right.
something deeper. So
right.
It's like that.
Okay.
I wonder what we're talking about then is really the capacity for memory, that attachments and feelings of loss are connected to the memories, and the memories are really the legacy. Whatever we want to impart to people, whatever we give to people, that may or may not be what they grasp, but they would grasp something maybe more intangible, and that would be what loss is about. Is perhaps not having the object. I hate using that word, but not having the person or the creature.
Mm-hmm.
Having the memory, and there's grieving for sure, but the memory is what we really have, and that's all we can ever really have. Someone behind you also.
Oh, okay. I'm reminded of the saying. It's a bit of an odd syntax that I've heard so many times growing up Jewish and having some more exposure through my son's bar mitzvah process. Hearing people in the community say when someone dies, may her memory be for a blessing.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So I want to share a little blessing that came my way with the death of a dear friend, in answer to your earlier question, Seth, who was a member of this community, who some people here may know, Dennis Turner, who died this past year. And we'll be missing him at our men's group meeting, which starts at 2. He was in my life for about 25 years.
Right.
He had inferior, I'm pretty sure his sensation function was his inferior function, even if it was in the third place. It was really not on sometimes.
Okay.
But he really did try to control it a lot.
Right.
And he went through an experience to keep himself alive through horrific ICU experience. I mean, the kind of stuff you read about why you should not go to the ICU.
Right.
But he did go for those heroic measures. And he had some, might have been ICU psychosis, or it might have been that he was really having visions of the other side that he shared some of with us. And there was light, and there was beauty, and there was peace. After he recovered from this experience, he went home and continued to work on his garden, which is what he did for the last few years of his life. And he created this masterpiece of a garden with some hardscape structure, including some portals that one could look through to see in through the other side. I took a photograph of him one day on the other side of that portal. A treasure.
How was the very end for him?
I was with him. I was one of the last people with him. I lived near him, so I stopped by one evening when I heard that the end was near, and he passed the next morning. And he was very peaceful and was very lucid in his last moments, having come through some hellish periods, but also being able to be very present for the process. So,
what was he, about 70?
He was 69.
Too young.
Yeah, but he had that kind of a good conscious death. It was not quick.
No. What about 3 years?
About 3 years.
And what form of cancer was it?
Biliary duct.
I see.
That's a very unusual cancer.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I've heard and I've experienced with patients and others good deaths, bad deaths. This sounds like a good death.
A particularly good death.
Yeah. Frau Jaffe, near the end, as I said, she lost function. I was writing my thesis for her, and she lost her eyesight, so I had to start tape recording my work and sending her tapes. This was back in '85. No internet then. And eventually the authorities said, the institute said, you can't have her as your thesis director any longer because she's losing too much capacity. But she would get students. Her death was a couple of years. She would get students from the university. She lived right above the university to come up and to read to her, and then she would tell them stories about Jung. So it was a good trip. And I heard that at the very end, she was in the hospital, and she had an analyst friend. They were very good friends. The analyst friend was dying at the same time. And so the analyst friend went into a coma and died. But Frau Jaffe came out of a coma and said, oh, how is my friend doing? And up until the end, she was concerned about her friend. And she was told that the friend had just died, and then Frau Jaffe slipped into the coma and just died. It was, from the people, I wasn't there at the time, but I've heard good accounts of it, and it was a good death. And Jung was very good to her in a lot of ways. He allowed her to be who she really was, and he provided for her, as I said, royalties from memory streams, reflections, and other things. There was one point, I mean, the legacy, when we speak of legacies, at the Jung Institute in Zurich were not always good, especially during World War II. The psychology club, this was before the Institute was founded, put a quota on Jews. And, and I think it was a 10% quota. And Jung, the club wouldn't allow Frau Jaffe to become a member. And so Jung went into the club, and as I understand the story, said, if you don't elect her, if you don't allow her in, I'm resigning. And so they made her a member of the psychology club. Which brings to mind Groucho Marx's remarks, but that's another story. But he did a lot of things for her that paved the way. She was his secretary for many years. And he was very good to her. And he entered into what he called Jaffe's project. And she wrote other things. She wrote a book called Word and Image, which is she wrote The Myth of Meaning. She wrote a number of things it was very clear that part of her meaning in life was to be in relationship to the great man. And to her, he was very good. I heard that there were times when he had a storm, but then it would pass. And she never felt threatened or frightened by him. She learned that this is a force of nature, essentially. That's how she approached it. And she did fine. And she had very real memories, good memories of him that she shared with me. And they helped to inform the way I feel about him, in spite of the fact that I'm Jewish and that there's a whole legacy about doing anti-Semitism that we carry around with us. And it's still there. There's a wonderful book, and I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called Lingering Shadows, Jungians, Freudians, and Anti-Semitism. It's a Shambhala Press book. It's worth reading. It's there were a series of seminars on Wednesday evenings in New York City. I would go up from Philadelphia to hear the speakers, and Tom Kirsch was one of the speakers, and when he was president of the IAP, there were others, and they addressed these issues. Very informative. And then there was a series of papers given in Paris at one of the international meetings. It's all contained within there. And the thing that strikes me the most, it was the last meeting in New York City, and Tom Kirsch got up. He's the president of the IAP, the International Association for Analytical Psychology, which is our group, the Jungian group. And he got up there and talked about what he understood of Jung, and Jung not being anti-Semitic. And then Erich Neumann's son. Erich Neumann is a very famous Jungian analyst who in many ways was the heir to Jung. Jung looked at him that way, and wanted him to head up the Jung Institute to be its first leader. But Neumann didn't want to return from Palestine. Anyway, Misha Neumann was a psychiatrist and president of the Israeli Psychoanalytic Association. And he got up, it's quite astounding. He said, well, in his opinion, Jung wasn't consciously anti-Semitic, but unconsciously he was. And then he proceeded to share a letter that Jung had written to Erich Neumann just after Kristallnacht, which is in the book, and it's worth getting the book to just read that letter. And Jung shows a very cold and unfeeling side of himself to his heir apparent, to his favorite disciple. And it's just, it's unseemly. That's the only way to put it. But it's important to read this, to see this side of Jung. Now, what Frau Jaffe said about this, because she and I talked about this a lot, was basically that, well, yes, I mean, Jung, he wasn't really anti-Semitic, but you have to remember that he was raised in Christian Europe, and it was sort of bred in the bone. He got it with the mother's milk, this sort of thing. And he had to, but she said he grew. He learned from his experiences. He developed a real interest in Judaism and Kabbalah, and he brought Gershom Scholem in to give a series of lectures at Eranos after World War II. He did his best to redeem himself. I believe that. I believe that, and I know she believed it, and I see definite evidence of that. But that's an issue that we always carry around with us. It's the shadow side, and almost everywhere where I go to speak, this issue comes up in one form or another.
The book is Jung, Freud, and Anti-Semitism.
Jungians, Freudians, and lingering shadows. Jungians, Freudians, and anti-Semitism. It's Maidenbaum and Martin, Aryeh Maidenbaum and Steve Martin, not the comedian, are the editors. It's very much worthwhile. Did you have some questions from the? Actually, yes, I do.
I have one more thing to say. The woman behind me wanted to speak as well. I just want to touch back to Dennis's garden again. There's a question for those of us who are having the added advantage today of getting some continuing education credits. There's a question about psychological functions in one's individuation into death. And this is how I understood it to Dennis, and it was implicit in what I said. I just want to make it explicit that with the inferior function for Dennis being the sensation function, by spending the last 3 years of his life with his hands in the dirt, creating this masterpiece that blossomed, that he was able to, in his deathbed, look out at day by day by day, was very, very meaningful. It was his way, I think, of connecting with his soul as he was getting ready to cross to the other side. So for all of us, what's your inferior function? Maybe spend some time there before the end comes.
Hopefully long before then, because part of your, someone asked the question before, do you really integrate the inferior function? I would say no. What you can do is introduce yourself to your inferior function, cultivate it, here we go, cultivate your inferior function, develop it to a certain extent, but you'll always know it's your inferior function. You will know that it is. Oh, yes?
The comment that I had wanted to make goes back to what you were talking about in terms of loss and grief and memory. And what I was also in touch with as you were speaking about that is that there's also grief and longing. I think that happens when there's a death where there's an idealized fantasy or a hope that the relationship might have been different, or I might have been different in relationship to this person who's leaving. And so I think that's another level of grieving that has to be worked through and supported and healed.
And it's also another level of memory.
It's connected to memory, yes. So that was my segue into that. Thank you.
All right. I just have one comment and one question here.
Okay.
And here's a comment, and it's Yu's statement about death and its trajectory is similar to that of Venerable Bidet, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And here he has attached a quote from Venerable Bidet's History of the English People. It seems to me that the life of a man on earth is like the swift flight of a single sparrow through the banqueting hall where you are sitting at dinner on a winter's day with your captains and counselors. In the midst, there is a comforting fire and a warm that warms the hall. Outside, the storms of winter, rain, and snow are raging. The sparrow flies swiftly through one of the windows of the hall and out through the other. While he is inside, the bird is safe from the winter storm. And after a few moments of comfort, he vanishes from sight into the wintry world from which he had come. So man appears on earth for a little while. But of what happens before this life, or what follows, we know nothing.
Oh.
That was a good quote.
And you have a question?
And then I do have a quick question here, going back to the topic about Erik Erikson.
Ah.
And it was, I understood that you said that Erik Erikson believed that trust and something
Wholeness.
were necessary for healthy development.
Wholeness.
Wholeness.
Yes. Trust and wholeness.
Could you elaborate just a little bit more?
Well, if you look at his first, let's see, how does it go? Trust versus distrust. Mistrust. Mistrust. This is the basic. This is the basis on which personality development proceeds. There has to be that basic trust there. And he also felt. By the way, he doesn't talk about resolving Oedipal conflict. He doesn't. He felt, at least I've never read it, he talks about becoming whole. And if you look at these different stages, this is what you're doing as you hit these different points. You're resolving these issues in a direction of becoming a more whole person until at the end. Let's see, what is the very last one? Integrity versus despair.
Ego integrity.
Yeah, or ego wisdom, it's sometimes called. But what is integrity? Integrity is wholeness, is becoming whole. He was very close. I've heard this from people who knew him. He apparently had some connection with Rollo May. I haven't mentioned his name today. He's a good person to mention in relationship to anxiety. He has a Kierkegaardian version of anxiety, which is very different from the psychoanalytic. But he's worth reading. I think Rollo May tried to meld the two, the sort of the existential and the Freudian approaches, especially to anxiety. I think on that note, we're done. Thank you all. It was a pleasure.